This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get a full year of CuriosityStream as well as my streaming service Nebula by using the link in the description. Not a lot of people can say they invented a genre. Early YouTube was a really interesting time. There were a lot more restrictions, it was a lot more unique of a platform, and there was a very different sense of scale and the feeling that you were essentially on uncharted territory. A lot of internet pioneers made their way here, internet figures whose work would set the tone for how the website and the internet as a whole would evolve. And it's impossible to talk about early YouTube without talking about the Angry Video Game Nerd. Angry Video Game Nerd, or AVGN for short, is a web series created by and starring James Rolfe. It's a simple show in which James, in character as the nerd, finds old terrible video games and reviews them, highlighting just how bad they are with swear words and skits and visual comedy. It quickly rose in popularity, earning a strong, passionate fanbase, a lot of acclaim, and creating the entire subsection of video reviews, specifically ones using caustic and rage critics. For years and years, it was this untouchable thing, the gold standard for classic online video content. But recently, more and more issues have emerged. If you click on a random video on the AVGN channel, Cinemassacre, or just any site really, like their Twitter or Facebook pages, chances are you'll find a surprising number of dislikes, if you still have those, a wild amount of hateful comments, and a bunch of memes complaining about James, his company, and his current work. How did we get here exactly? What caused all this backlash? It's a long story. A long story involving multi-channel networks, plagiarism, 80s rock cover bands, subreddit moderation drama, podcasts, a crowdfunded movie, Gilbert Gottfried, lewd photos, racist webcomics, and a drunk playthrough of Super Mario Bros. That's considered lost media. This is going to take a while, so please grab your bottle of Rolling Rock and sit back while I try to explore the Cinemassacre backlash. James Rolfe always wanted to be a filmmaker. As a kid, he grew up fascinated by films, constantly watching old monster movies, making short films with his friends on a VHS camera or in Mario Paint, taking up the hobby even as he grew up, and continuing all the way through film school. He was very prolific for his age, basically always constantly shooting something. It was what he was really passionate about, it was what he really wanted to do. And then in 2004, he made a short film that would change the trajectory of his life forever. In the short, entitled Bad NES Games, James played a stereotypical nerd character who complained about the game Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, with the basis of the joke being his over-the-top reaction to some of the difficult or frustrating things that occurred in the game.
And why do you have to die when you fall in the water? That's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. This guy can go all over fighting hordes of evil monsters, but he can't even fucking swim?
James would make another video in the Bad NES Game series, this one about the game Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This video is a lot simpler, with James as the nerd sitting in front of his computer, drinking a bottle of Rolling Rock beer, and talking about how terrible the game is, with some footage of him playing it with the camera pointed towards the TV.
I mean, you'd rather superglue your asshole shut than play that game. You'd rather drown in gasoline. You'd rather, the thing is...
And for about 2 years, that was it. These were just 2 shorts James made, and then he moved on. But James' friends who saw these thought they were hilarious, and one of them eventually pressured James into uploading them to YouTube, still a fairly new site at that time, while also creating another short, this time covering the game The Karate Kid. At the time, the channel was called James Nintendo Nerd, and the series was called The Angry Nintendo Nerd Trilogy. But then these videos blew up and went incredibly viral. People started sharing them around, quoting them, imitating them, and just in general seemed invested in seeing more. And so James kept making more, and they got more elaborate, and he started doing skits, and he started doing narratives, and getting into gaming history, and videos started having higher production values and more effects, and it just became a whole thing. Eventually he changed the name to The Angry Video Game Nerd, both so that he could avoid potential legal issues by using the brand name Nintendo, and also so he could get away with covering other game systems. The James Nintendo Nerd channel eventually changed its name to Angry Video Game Nerd, and then later on changed its name to Cinemassacre, the name of Rolfe's production company. He eventually would partner with companies like Game Trailer and Skrya to release and show new episodes of AVGN. AVGN's popularity cannot be overstated. People were so into this thing that he has been able to keep going for 200 episodes so far. The main channel has 3.5 million subscribers. He basically created the whole video genre of angry guy gets mad at video games, which led to the creation of the Nostalgia Critic, which led to the creation of Channel Awesome, which led to the creation of the video essay genre, which has led you directly here, now, watching this video. I would probably not have a job if not for James Rolfe. In a lot of respects, it can be hard to understand exactly what made AVGN become so popular. I mean, we live in the stage of the internet that's considered post-Angry Critic, where this style of video is so routinely mocked and more casual and low-key internet reviewers have taken prominence. But, it wasn't always like this. First and foremost, in my opinion, a lot of what was popular in the pre-2010 internet, and arguably still today, was content that you generally wouldn't find via traditional media outlets. The AVGN fulfilled a specific niche that you wouldn't see on normal television because of its heavy focus on old and retro gaming content, its heavy mockery and references to pop culture, as well as its hardcore vulgarity. It made the series stand out versus things like X-Play or other gaming content. If I had to think of any point of comparison, the closest equivalent I can think of is actually Clerks. Much like Clerks, early AVGN benefited from being a low-budget independent production trying to capture a certain subset of emotions and feelings that the average young 20-something could relate to, while also featuring a fuck ton of swear words and dark, gross humor scripted out with the same purposeful precision as a Shakespearean monologue. Though, of course, Clerks was meant to represent the emotions of working in a dead-end job you hate, while AVGN was meant to represent the emotions of being incredibly frustrated at a video game you played. It was really the perfect time for something like this to come out too. Back in 2006, covering NES games was bound to divide your fan base into two categories. Either people who were around for the NES era as kids who are nostalgic for that time and the memories and frustrations that came with it, or younger people who were born after then and enjoy learning about a moment in video gaming they weren't aware of before. If you want a modern-day equivalent of this, think about how Scott the Woz covers a lot of Wii games, and think about the existential horror of the fact that the Wii is as old now as the NES was when James started doing his videos. James is by far not the first person to cover video games online, and definitely not the first person to do the whole angry, caustic critic angle. Just from the top of my head, there's Agony Booth and Sean Baby. But what he brought was a sense of production and presentation and enough professionalism to make it work. In an era where we were just starting to get an internet where anyone could upload videos, the angry video game nerd being something that did things like have quality audio and multiple camera angles and had properly captured game footage and wasn't edited in Windows Movie Maker made it stand out. Yeah, it was never a high-budget affair, and James never even tried to hide that this was anything other than him in his room with maybe some friends in Halloween costumes showing up. But the fact that he knew the basics of filmmaking made him really, really above his peers, even once copycats began showing up. And for all the backlash this style of angry reviewing gets, the whole, grr, I'm an angry critic and this thing is poppy dog shit shtick, it actually does work really well here, if anything because it's clear that at every point of the way, James is playing this character tongue-in-cheek. I know oftentimes, especially around this era, you'd see people say inflammatory or dumb things in their videos, and then they'd counter by saying, no, that wasn't me saying it, I'm playing a character. See? But I feel like James is one of the few cases where that's true and it's always felt true. Not just because non-nerd videos made it clear that James was just an overwhelmingly mellow guy, but because the nerd was so absurd and out there in his rhetoric and actions that it was clear that Rolf intended for the statements to be punchlines rather than definitive statements of holier-than-thou opinions. Like, I sincerely doubt he wrote in a scene where he shits on Bugs Bunny's face with the intention to get his true feelings out there. It's all a punchline, highlighted to the most over-the-top absurdity. And while the nerd being an angry, screaming shouter is a popular perception, I think one of the things that stands out is how some of the funniest lines are delivered in this honestly impressively casual manner. Like this line from his NES Accessories video has stuck with me for over a decade.
Cats and dogs would piss and shit on it. In fact, just thinking about it makes me feel like having an anal evacuation.
And sometimes the jokes don't even need to be vulgar. Like this one from the same video has also stuck with me for some reason just because of the sheer delight Rolf puts in his delivery.
I'm drinking Rollin' Rock on the Rollin' Rocker. Rollin' Rock, Rollin' Rocker. Yeah, Rollin' Rock on the Rollin' Rocker.
God, I love the NES Accessory video. It's my favorite episode. And I think that's the main takeaway I've gotten from going back through these old videos. As I started watching, I expected to find them maybe a bit cringe or poorly aged or not funny, but no, I still like these. Like, they're not perfect, and there's episodes I like more than others, but that was always true. They're these easily digestible videos that somehow balance fun, casual insights into video games and this weird, vulgar, funny character. This could just be nostalgia talking. I could totally understand someone trying to watch these now and just not clicking with it, but I don't know, for me, a lot of the AVGN catalog has aged pretty well. I think something that's really interesting to think about is that while there is a very clear through line between the angry video game nerd and the modern video essay, when you actually break it down, I'd argue a basic AVGN episode bears more resemblance to what we now think of as a Let's Play. The majority of nerd episodes, especially early on, focused on the process of playing the game rather than a history lesson or grand thesis about the game as a whole. You might think this makes the experience more shallow compared to other long-form videos, and maybe you're right, but I think it's a different type of appeal. The goal here is to simulate what it's like to play the game, and most of these early videos accomplish that goal. The early years of the AVGN went basically without much controversy or anything really worth talking about. That's not to say there was never any backlash or criticism or drama or anything like that. Dare I say the nerd has always had some form of criticism, but it was more generic Stuff like people being upset when he moved to game trailers or Screw Attack, people upset about the sometimes slow upload rate, people upset that James was featuring more of his friends like Mike Matei and Kyle Justin on the show, and accusations that the series had jumped the shark or wasn't as good as it once was. But a lot of these complaints are, well, fairly standard. Like, it's the sort of thing any creator with a wide enough fan base and enough time is going to deal with. And more than that, they were generally very scattered opinions. Like, there wasn't a centralized moment of backlash or hub for anti-AVGN opinions or anything like that. So while it's worth noting, there's not much here worth going in depth about because a lot of it didn't go much deeper than, I don't like that he didn't properly review the Atari 5200 and stuff like that. If anything, this era for the nerd is more defined by the drama involving other people rather than James himself. Things like the nostalgia critic starting up and the publicized quote-quote feud that came from it and, well, the irate gamer, which is a long story. Basically, there was this guy named Chris Bors, who is actually my friend on Facebook for some reason, who decided to start off his own enraged video game review show called The Irate Gamer. Beyond the premise being similar to AVGN, Bors also directly lifted jokes from AVGN episodes and would sometimes cover the exact same games. This was a whole big piece of drama because if there's one thing the internet always universally hates, it's plagiarism, and why yes, this is foreshadowing. Anyway, Chris emailed James to say that he was a big fan and that he might have accidentally used some of James's jokes in his videos. Said email will be leaked online, which only fueled the rivalry between the two creators' fan base even more. Additional stuff happened that honestly could take up its whole own video, but by now Bors is seemingly settled into his own corner of the internet, and he and James have settled whatever beef there might have been between them, with James actually guest starring as the nerd in an Irate Gamer episode. But besides that, Cinemassacre was running mainly drama and conflict-free. The success of AVGN led to James being able to do other projects, such as his horror movie marathon series, Monster Madness, his short-form rant series, You Know It's Bullshit, and his board game narrative review series, Board James, which is, in my opinion, the best thing James has ever done. If I had to define the first moment where things started to change, though, it would have to be the Angry Video Game Nerd movie. James Rolfe always had ambitions of being a filmmaker. It was what he set out to do. It's what he went to school for. So it only makes sense that as soon as the AVGN took off, he would begin trying to figure out a way to translate the nerd into the film format. After all the popularity, the nerd would be a good way to realize his filmmaking dreams, because it's easier to gain interest in a product that people are already interested in. The Angry Video Game Nerd movie was formally announced to the world in September of 2010. When James put out a video explaining that his slowed down video release schedule was because he was working on finally putting together the movie. After years and years of production, the AVGN movie finally came out in 2014. I won't spend too much time talking about the movie or the production of it for a variety of reasons. One, there's so much stuff about the production, promotion, release, and state of the finished film itself that one could easily spend an entire video focusing solely on it. Two, I want to keep this video focused primarily on ways in which the Cinemassacre brand as a whole has suffered backlash and the stepping stones that led there, meaning focusing primarily on the main channel and content that people have seen. But perhaps more importantly, three, I started watching the movie and disliked it so much that I couldn't finish it, and I decided that the only way I would devote more of my time to it is if people actively paid me money for the purpose of getting me to do so, and by that I mean join my Patreon and message me saying do the AVGN movie, then I might consider it. It was just not something I could tolerate much of. I guess the main points that I want to get at here is that the movie was a big turning point, both in the audience and in James as a creator. Making a movie is a lot of hard work. It requires a lot of money, commitment, energy, and time. There were a lot of things done to make up for this. For example, since the usual Hollywood investors weren't willing to fund the film, James took to Indiegogo and crowdfunded it. This was actually surprisingly controversial at the time. Like, this was back in 2011, right as crowdfunding was beginning to catch on and when other internet personalities were making movies, but they were like channel awesome anniversary films made with this basic equipment and virtually no budget. So there were some people wondering why James didn't just fund the movie himself and why he was relying on fans to do it. And the answer is because, like, he needed to. Movies cost a lot of money, and it's fine to crowdfund to help make them. Obviously, crowdfunding won the battle not just for James, but also just in our general culture. The AVGN movie managed to raise $325,000, way more than its initial goal of $75,000. But similar discourse would happen again when the film eventually came out, and unless you paid for it as part of the campaign, it cost $10 to rent on Vimeo. With discussions happening over whether or not James should have put it out for free, considering the AVGN is a free product, and also the fact that the film was fan-funded and should thus be accessible to be viewed by the fans. Once again, though, this basically died down because, like, yeah, it's fine to charge money for your work, but it did start sowing the seeds for what was to come. Then there's how the film's production affected James and his work, because like I said earlier, films are a lot of work, and it's understandable that his usual workflow would have to be adjusted in order to accommodate for it. For example, before James started working on the film, he had a strict 2 AVGN video per month release schedule. That's not really all that practical in the grand scheme of things, especially when he's also spending a lot of time trying to get the film done. So not only did he scale down his release output, but he also bulk filmed a bunch of AVGN episodes and aired them throughout 2012 and 2013. This was basically universally seen as a bad period for AVGN videos. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why, but they just sort of felt like they were sleepwalking. That's the best word that comes to mind, at least. They were repetitive, basic, relied on a lot of standard nerd tropes, and didn't seem to have the same time and attention put into them as previous ones did. Things eventually turned around, and the post-movie AVGN episodes were generally regarded as good, with some of my favorites coming from that era at least. But it definitely left a mark, as that was around the time that you really started seeing comments debating over whether or not the nerd should retire. That was going to be a dominant conversation for a while. Not just for the fanbase, but seemingly for James as well. Where at this point in time, he had done over 100 episodes of AVGN. The 100th episode seemed like it could have been setting up for a finale, but it wasn't. Then the movie came out and it seemed like it would have been a good finale, and then it wasn't. Then in 2016, a 10th anniversary episode reviewing Mega Man came out and seemed like it could be a finale, and then it wasn't. There were these constant signs of James wanting to give the nerd closure, but never seeming to fully commit to it. What didn't help is that this was also around the time that Doug Walker's then retirement from Nostalgia Critic was still fresh in people's minds. So the question of whether or not online reviewers could theoretically step down if they wanted to had been introduced. So I guess the question is, what exactly happened to cause this much fixation about it around this period of time? There's this ongoing belief that people have online that working on the AVGN movie sort of burnt James out and might have broken him a little bit. I'm not going to say fully that that's the case because I don't know James, and to my knowledge he's never publicly spoken about this, but for what it's worth, future AVGN producer Justin Silverman stated that he also believes this to be true, and when you think about it, it does make sense. Making movies is tiring. The AVGN movie was a years-long process that took a lot of effort and a lot of stress and a lot of money. And the thing is that James wanted this to be his big break. He specifically decided to go to Hollywood to shoot it, even though it made the whole thing more challenging and more expensive than if he shot it literally anywhere else. He paid money to have it premiere at the Egyptian Theater. He clearly put a lot of himself and his energy and passion into this film, and it just didn't really pay off. The movie didn't receive the warmest of reviews. It had popular screening events with fans, and there are some fans who like it, but that's it. It's just the fans. It didn't really garner him any recognition or popularity or acclaim outside of people who were already familiar with him as the angry video game nerd. Which makes sense because from what I watched, yeah, I can't really imagine anyone else but fans getting anything out of this movie. So I can imagine having his live stream become something that was either ignored or mocked by the general public was not that good of a feeling. That's not to say it's that simple, because a good counter-argument to this is that James would go on to make some pretty good AVGN episodes and some top-tier Board James episodes right after the movie's release. So it wasn't as if he was fully creatively checked out, and another argument can be made that his general demeanor shift around this time was more because this was also when he had his first kid, which changes a person's priorities, but we'll get into that later. I guess the point is that regardless of whether or not this whole movie burnout thing is true, it does mark a drastic turning point with the way James viewed the nerd, as well as the way James approached his creative presence and ambitions. But that's not really the full story, because there's also another important thing that happened around this time. So, during the movie's production period, James couldn't devote the same amount of attention to the channel as he used to. However, there was still a push for content to be put up there and for Cinemassacre programs to keep coming out. In order to do so, more control was given to James's creative partner to make content for the channel. And this is where we have to talk about Mike Matei. Mike Matei is a longtime friend of James Rolfe. The two met in college and maintained a close relationship, both as friends and also co-workers. Mike was an instrumental part in the early legacy of the angry video game nerd. He was the one who originally convinced James to upload and produce more AVGN videos. He's the one who created the original James Nintendo Nerd channel. He did the title card artwork for the first 100 episodes. If there was a character that appeared in the show, chances are they were played by Mike. He would co-write the scripts, helped edit the videos, and it turns out some of the gameplay footage used in them was actually his footage. Mike Matei is an important person in the history of the angry video game nerd and Cinemassacre as a whole, and he is one of the most divisive figures in the fanbase. Here's the thing. The thing that made James really notable as an online internet creator was that despite being a guy who reviewed video games online, he didn't really have the presence of an online gamer guy. And the thing is that Mike does. Mike has more of an internet presence. Mike was more vocal about his opinions. Mike was more invested in playing games and critiquing and making content about them. Mike was more invested in interacting with fans, both positively and negatively. So because of all of this, it made a lot of sense for Mike to be in charge of a lot more of the side content as well as more of the social media and public relations side of Cinemassacre. It's clearly stuff he's more inclined to do compared to James, and that worked. Kind of. See, there had already been sort of mixed views and small bits of drama with Mike before. Remember how I said earlier that Chris Bohr's irate gamer plagiarism email to James Rolfe got leaked online? Yeah, that was because Mike leaked it. He was really upset that the irate gamer videos kept copying the nerds, so he decided to post the private email on the forums in order to do something, I guess. That was just sort of the person Mike was. Just very incendiary is the word I'd use.
Hey, look how many bolts of energy he's throwing! He didn't even come close to doing that last time! What the fuck is this fucking cheap fucking shit?
For a while, though, it wasn't too bad, primarily because Mike's role was mostly either behind the scenes or in a variety of makeup and costumes. The one time he did get to do a lot of on-camera stuff as a normal person was in Board James, when he played a character named Motherfucker Mike, literally playing off of how much of a motherfucker Mike could be. This all really changed around 2011, though, as James spent more and more of his time working on the film. More solo Mike content began to be posted on the main Cinemassacre channel. His first vid, a short guide on how you can glitch your way over the flagpole on Super Mario Bros. 1, was a surprising viral hit, and he continued to make his own stuff, be it more glitch videos, top 10 lists, or reviews of more obscure games. He also had his second solo viral hit with the video Minecraft with Gadget, a video that has been transformed countless times in a number of YTPs and song remixes, and is notable for being a video so unfunny that it's actually one of the funniest videos I've seen, and I can recite the entire thing.
Cause they like to build brown bricks with Minecraft. I also like to build brown bricks with Minecraft. It's the most fun you can possibly have.
The non-infamously bad Mike stuff did have its own set of fans, but also its own set of detractors. On a basic level, you had some just upset that there was James-less content being uploaded on the Cinemassacre channel, especially once there seemed to be more Mike stuff coming out than James stuff, but you also had people who just didn't really care for Mike, especially not after seeing more of him. There was the creation of James and Mike Mondays, a Let's Play series in which James and Mike played games on Mondays. I'd honestly say it was a pretty good series. Like, it's overall pretty chill. If most two-person Let's Play series are supposed to simulate a playing games with your best friend dynamic, then James and Mike Mondays showcases the vibe of when you and your best friend are just chilling during the day and playing a video game together. Not over the top, not really hyperactive or angry, just sort of going through and making small talk and trying your best to beat a game someone brought over. I don't know, it has a certain appeal. It was quality Mike content, at least. Then more and more actual controversial moments started happening. In no particular timeline order, there was the time that he streamed Super Mario Bros. On the main channel while being pissed drunk, and ended up deleting the stream afterwards, and now that stream is officially classified on the Lost Media Wiki as Lost Media. There were times in which he'd use the official Cinemassacre Tumblr to tweet out details about himself having sex, such as the post, 2 hours of doggy style and going again, load was fucking huge, smiley face emoji, Mike. But this all pales in comparison to the Reddit drama. Like most popular online media things, Cinemassacre and AVGN has a presence on Reddit. Makes sense. Reddit, especially earlier in its life, was a very gamer-dominated website, so of course it would have a large forum of people talking about a gaming-related personality. A few subreddits popped up, but the main one that gained any traction was simply the Cinemassacre. And what's notable is that the main mod there was Mike. And in general, there was a lot of frustration about his modding style. People frustrated with the state of post-movie AVGN would often have their negative comments deleted. People asking about Bootsy, a frequent Cinemassacre collaborator who suddenly stopped appearing in videos, would have their comments get deleted. People who asked about the Drunk Mario livestream would have their comments be deleted. There seemed to be an active attempt to avoid any sort of negative discussion or talk of controversy in the main subreddit. And then things take a turn for the weird, and I can't really show anything on screen for this part. So I'm just going to put up a picture of a tape measure and zoom into it really, really slowly. Okay? Okay. So there was this running gag going around the fandom about the size of Mike Matei's junk. This was mainly based on the way Mike's shorts would crinkle up in certain photos and footage in order to make it appear that... Yeah, it was a joke that would get passed around and shared and people would laugh at. Eager Raptor from Game Grumps would even reference the joke about Mike having a 10-incher on an episode of Steam Train. It was just a light gag until one day, Mike Matei, in an attempt to stop the speculation, decided to use the official Cinemassacre Reddit account to post a picture on the official Cinemassacre subreddit of a dick next to a tape measurer, and then used the official Cinemassacre Twitter account to tweet it out as well. Yes, I've seen the photo. The weird thing about it is that, like, the tape measurer is actually farther away from the camera, so it's using a forced perspective Lord of the Rings style to make it look like it's bigger than it actually is, which I'm not sure if that was deliberately part of the joke. Also, in 2020, people discovered that the picture was actually posted on the internet before Mike posted it there, So more than likely he just pulled this photo from somewhere else. In the immediate aftermath, the posts were all deleted, but so was anything bringing up the post at all. There were no explanations given for the pictures, either from Mike or other mods, and no immediate statement or acknowledgement was made. The frustration over Mike Matei deleting any messages about him posting a dick pic led to the creation of the Cinemassacre Truth, an offshoot subreddit with 15,000 current members where people could openly discuss the controversies going on, and to the hub of the Cinemassacre backlash that the channel is currently undergoing. Yes, the reason we're all here today is because of a dick pic. The Cinemassacre Truth paved the way for about the sort of thing you can expect when you have a subreddit branch off because of disagreements over the original sub's moderation. Warfare. There was a passionate drive to chronicle everything Mike had been doing wrong, as well as uncover anything that they didn't know about. This is how some more pretty bad info about Mike got unveiled, ranging from asshole-ish stuff like him commissioning an old woman to make a Klingon costume and then never paying her, him using an alt account to trash-talk other reviewers, as well as argue with people online asking about the tape measure situation, and perhaps most infamously, uncovered a series of incredibly racist comics Mike made in college called The Loco Bandito that was full of basically every tasteless thing and racial slur you could possibly imagine. I wish I could say that there was any sort of closure to that whole arc, but there really wasn't. Mike released a statement in order to help calm down some of it, but it really only addressed the bannings, the leaked mod mail, Minecraft with Gadget, and vaguely talks about whatever happened with Bootsy. Notably absent from this post is any mention of the tape measure situation or the Loco Bandito. It didn't really satisfy anyone, and there was a push to continue to get more answers, to get James to acknowledge it, and to even get Mike removed from Cinemassacre. But none of that happened. Nothing else came out of it, and instead Mike continued to work for Cinemassacre for years until he quit in December of 2020 to focus on his streaming career. A weirdly low-key end to an important and incendiary figure in AVGN history. What wasn't low-key, however, was the Cinemassacre Truth, because even though the drama with Mike might have calmed down, there was a new challenger on the horizon that would become the subreddit's primary focus and enemy. One of the big changes that happened in 2014 was the essential shutdown of both Game Trailers and Screw Attack, the previous networks that AVGN was distributed on. Game Trailers was acquired by Defy Media, who would then shut it down years later because of their own issues, which is too much to go over now. Meanwhile, Screw Attack was acquired by Rooster Teeth and essentially rebranded into a company that only puts out death battle videos. This left AVGN without a distributor and forced the series to make its primary home YouTube again. It was around this time, either 2014 or 2015, that Cinemassacre partnered up and joined Screenwave Media, a multi-channel network founded by Ryan, who had been assisting Cinemassacre for a few years at that point. For those of you who don't know, a multi-channel network, abbreviated as an MCN, is essentially a company that handles multiple channels and is designed to assist and manage them in business or creative matters, though primarily business. The idea is that they deal with things that the creators might not necessarily be able to on their own, things like setting up ads and sponsorships, creating and distributing merch, and on a basic level providing a quantity of resources like access to various different licenses, programs, sound and visual banks, etc. In exchange for this, MCNs generally take a certain cut of the profits from that channel. If you're not familiar with MCNs, that's sort of the point. They used to be more in the forefront of YouTube conversations, especially in early YouTube days. For one, because that was the era in which it was basically impossible to monetize your channel or deal with the copyright system unless you were partnered with an MCN. But alternatively, there were also several controversies with a lot of early MCNs regarding either withholding funds from creators or signing up as many channels as possible, offering them little to no assistance, and claiming revenue from a bunch of them, and essentially creating your own Office Space scam out of a bunch of teenagers' YouTube accounts. But those were select controversies with their own stories. For the most part, the reason why you don't hear much about MCNs is because their job is to serve as backdoor assistants rather than executives hanging overhead as creative consultants. This is why when Cinemassacre signed on to Screenwave, it initially wasn't really remarked upon by the fanbase and went largely unnoticed. It wasn't really until around 2017 or 2018 that things began to take a turn and Screenwave made themselves known. This was the period of a lot of changes with how Cinemassacre operated, specifically as it relates to monetization and profits. During this time, more and more videos were released with sponsors, a practice which wasn't really done too often on the channel beforehand, until basically every video, regardless if it was a nerd episode or a small side thing, had some sort of brand partnership attached. People started noticing various different format changes that were happening, such as the very profane AVGN theme song being gone from most videos, or Rolf now calling his series You Know It's BS rather than You Know It's Bullshit, both of which were done primarily to minimize the risk of getting videos demonetized or age restricted based on swear words being present in the first minute. And perhaps the most obvious change, every single original AVGN illustrated title card that had been used for the thumbnails was changed up with a standardized YouTube thumbnail format of James's face photoshopped next to whatever the subject of the video was in order to get the algorithm to boost those old videos. That was an incredibly controversial move to say the least, and this isn't even getting into how different the AVGN episodes were beginning to feel, a subtle shift that gradually became more and more noticeable until people asked what was up. It was around this point in August of 2018 that two things happened. One, the people at Screenwave Media began appearing in videos on the channel in a series called Rental Reviews. though I'll talk about this later. And James released a video in which he says that Screenwave has taken on a lot of the AVGN editing work and has also been working with James on writing the scripts, and thus the current backlash against Cinemassacre and Screenwave media began. And it's only intensified since then, to the point where the Cinemassacre subreddits, both of them at this point, are basically full of nothing but anger towards Screenwave, what they've done to the channel, and the individual members. You'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who is openly and passionately a fan of the work Screenwave has done for Cinemassacre. It's hard to explain exactly why people have such negative reactions towards Screenwave and their members. On some level, it's inevitable. History has shown that fans are going to be incredibly hostile to any new force that enters Cinemassacre or any popular channel. A similar thing happened when Mike and Bootsy and Kyle Justin first started appearing in videos. Though it's worth noting that when Screenwave began making a more direct presence in AVGN was also around the time that Kyle and Bootsy stopped making any appearances on the channel and seemed to be effectively unpersoned, which inevitably made it seem like Screenwave were attempts to be replacements, or at the very least put them in the position of filling those shoes, which fans as a whole haven't actually taken too kindly to. A lot of this is because of the optics of corporatalization. With people like Mike and Kyle and Bootsy, you had the sense that these people were James' friends that he had a long history with. Conversations make it seem like James might have known a fair bit of the Screenwave guys for a while, but the problem is that their unfamiliarity with viewers mixed with their status as employees of the network Cinemassacre is signed to, as well as appearing in the videos right around the time that the channel shifted priorities to monetization, leads to the feeling, whether correct or not, that their presence and purpose is a matter of business and executive interference, especially when Screenwave members seemingly start to appear in every video and every project, with Cinemassacre content seemingly featuring more new, unfamiliar Screenwave people out of nowhere rather than James and the usual Cinemassacre crew. That's not to say that there aren't reasons why people might not like them just based on their own behavior. There's Justin Silverman, for example, higher up at Screenwave and currently credited as a producer for Cinemassacre, seemingly handling a lot of the content planning and organization. Justin originally got his start on the channel Silvermania, which has a history of controversies and issues. For starters, there's video footage of Justin saying the N-word several times in a skit.
I hate the N-word, and by N-word, I mean nerd, not n***, because that would be racist, and I'm not a racist, I have a black friend.
As well as footage of Justin in a Klan outfit next to a swastika and Confederate flag. Now, these were taken from comedy skits Justin did on the channel, skits that he has since disowned and said that he regrets. One of them was about how the actual N-word is the word nerd, and the other a joke about how there are so many AVGN knockoffs that the only original option left is to be a racist video game reviewer, which is a bad joke. There's already a million of those on YouTube. I know he says that he regrets these and that they were unfunny attempts to be edgy, and fair enough, though I will say we're talking about jokes an at the time 30-year-old man made in 2012. Not a child in a far gone, long ago era. There was also controversy when Justin was accidentally invited on the late gaming YouTuber Total Biscuit's podcast and proceeded to act like an asshole on it until he was kicked off. Months later, someone on the Silvermania team, possibly even Justin himself by his own admittance, made a YouTube comment joking about Total Biscuit's eventually fatal cancer diagnosis. According to Justin, he and Total Biscuit managed to meet up before he passed and settled things out, but that's still, that's something. Though the thing about all that I just told you is that it wasn't the cause of why AVGN fans didn't like Justin. The only reason that stuff came to prominence is because people in the Cinemassacre Truth already didn't like Justin based on his appearances on the channel and then started doing some digging. For what it's worth, Screenwave has taken a mixed response to the Cinemassacre Truth. There are those like Ciaran, the guy who seems to be the primary AVGN editor these days, who really vocally do not like it. And then you have Justin, who frequently posts there, did an AMA there, and will include Cinemassacre Truth memes and references in Cinemassacre videos, often using the various derisive nicknames the subreddit has for him. There's even stuff that's more subtle, like some Cinemassacre videos being uploaded at exactly 5:40 EST, a reference to a meme that gained traction on the subreddit when people took note of a video where James made a big deal of having to leave and be done with recording by 5:40. This sort of stuff honestly hasn't really helped ease tensions between the subreddit and Screenwave, especially not as more controversies pile up and there's more dissatisfaction over the state of Cinemassacre. And to some extent, this isn't really going to go away. A big part of the issue are things like Screenwave writing and editing AVGN episodes, with the common belief being that James is completely and totally uninvolved with the production of the videos, save for just appearing in them and reciting the lines. This isn't helped by the occasional presence of things like footage of gameplay which shows that it was captured on Ciaran's computer, or more and more references to subject matter that James Rolfe wouldn't have any knowledge of, and all these other clues that get left around that make it clear that James isn't the only one operating the machine here. James attempted to assure a lot of worries about Screenwave, explaining that if it wasn't for them, more AVGN episodes wouldn't be coming out at all, and the series would have ended in 2018. But the thing is that these people don't like the AVGN episodes that Screenwave are producing in the first place. It's like if you complained to a restaurant manager about how a chef served you a sandwich and you thought it tasted inedible, and the manager responded by saying, well, if it wasn't for that chef, you wouldn't be able to eat at all. Like, it's just really missing the point that these people aren't really happy with the current content. And this is where I have to play my hand into it a bit, because I feel like I need to be open and transparent about my perspective on this, who I am as a person, and how my experience is inevitably going to frame the way in which I see this. So for starters, as you may or may not know, I myself am represented by a network. Standard, to be precise. I'm not going to go in depth about any of that, but obviously that means that, like, personally speaking, I'm not going to have a problem with MCNs or brand sponsorships in and of themselves. But there's also another thing here that feels like I should probably mention. So, some of you may know this, and a surprising amount of you don't, but when I'm not talking into my microphone and making my little videos on here, I do work on another channel, one vastly more popular of mine called Sarah's Ad. Much like this one, it focuses a lot on media and internet culture analysis. There, I primarily work with Sarah on co-writing the scripts for each video, though occasionally I have done assorted editing work as well. I started officially working with them around August 2020 when the channel was already incredibly popular and had several viral hit videos. If you're wondering why I'm mentioning this, well, it's because this is going to affect the way in which I view Screenwave working with Cinemassacre. Like, I don't necessarily mind that AVGN is co-writers or that someone else does the editing work for it, because that's me. That's what I do. I also joined into an already popular channel and began doing significant creative work on it. And I was incredibly conscious that when I did that, I was going to be assuming the Screenwave type presence, that if I wasn't careful, I would have people saying that I ruined Sarah's ad and that my inclusion caused the channel to jump the shark. So yeah, that's the perspective I'm approaching this with, and I hope that I can use it to maybe clarify some things, or at least give my take on the matter. Obviously, I can't speak for Screenwave and Cinemassacre and how they do things. I imagine Sarah's ad is a much different operation. Maybe they're more efficient than we are, considering that at the end of the day, Sarah and I are just two friends who hop on Discord calls and make I think you should leave references at each other until it's 3 a.m. and the script is finished. But one of the sticking points that you see a lot regarding Screenwave and James is arguments over whether or not James actually does write the scripts and edit the footage, with Screenwave and James seeming to give inconsistent answers, and the fanbase under the impression that because of that, it means James doesn't actually do anything anymore and they're all lying to save face. Though from my perspective, that's not necessarily true. Part of the reason why, when you start to have a writing team, it gets hard to answer the question of who writes what, is because the writing and creation process isn't anything entirely consistent. Unless you're in an impossibly organized and optimized system where everyone has clear-cut roles, everyone's contribution is going to be a bit different depending on the project and depending on what's needed at that time. So if you were to ask Sarah and I if Sarah still writes the scripts, the answer would be yes, obviously. And if you ask me if I write the scripts, the answer would be yes, obviously. And if you ask us who writes the majority of the scripts, the answer would be a giant question mark because there's not really an answer to that. Sometimes Sarah takes the lead, sometimes I take the lead, sometimes I write half of it, sometimes I only write a paragraph, and there's no real consistency regarding who writes what. We both open up the document and begin writing on it at the same time, choosing which section we think we're more interested in or best equipped to write about. When co-writing works, this is the biggest benefit of it. By getting more heads into the situation, you can play to everyone's strength and produce a final product that's more all-encompassing. For example, when writing something like the All or Nothing video Sarah and I did, it made sense for Sarah to write up stuff regarding the history of the All or Nothing post and what the Tumblr landscape was like at that time, considering they were actually there and have more first-hand experience with it. Meanwhile, it made more sense for me to talk about All or Nothing from a production standpoint, talking about the Kickstarter and the practicality of getting something like this made, considering my history and background studying film and film production. We managed to keep the scripts feeling consistent because, well, beyond Sarah and I being very similar in our interests and style, we sit down before we start writing and have a conversation about the subject we're covering, creating an outline going over what we want to talk about, and ironing out our feelings and what we think our main argument for the video should be. This means that even if we're technically reviewing something, like making a video about how much we don't like the Dear Evan Hansen movie, we can both be sure that what's being written on the page and ends up on screen is a good representation of how we both feel. Theoretically, I would hope Cinemassacre does the same thing, so that even if James isn't the primary writer for that episode, there's a consistent goal in mind that everyone is considering when they make this. And as for things like editing and gameplay footage being captured by other people, well, that could be a sign that James doesn't play the games anymore, or it could just be a matter of editing convenience at that time. Something like the gameplay from the Chex Quest video being captured by Ciaran could mean that Ciaran played the game, or it could be just a matter of needing footage of a certain thing, and well, Ciaran's already the editor, so why not get it himself? Not saying that that's what happened, but rather why it doesn't necessarily bother me to see footage from other people in these videos. I mean, for starters, it's not anything new. Mike would use some of his gameplay and nerd videos, and furthermore, if you have several writers working on this, then you'd want them all to have played the game to some extent and come with their own footage or reports from the experience. When Sarah and I write, we definitely bring our own research to the table, which means that some sources and graphics come from them and some come from me. And sometimes while one of us is editing, we have to ask the other for help finding something or capturing something or whatever. I've had to download Crime Scene Kitchen promos and create a folder of Bingus fan art to help Sarah out with editing. I've had to ask Sarah to help me track down old Tumblr and social media posts when I've done editing. Acquiring materials for someone else isn't wrong, nor is editing for someone else either. I get a lot of the backlash comes from being frustrated that it isn't a James-only passion project anymore, but there's nothing inherently bad about having people to help with writing and editing and research and other things. In fact, I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to find a popular YouTube channel that doesn't have a co-writer or doesn't outsource their editing. Having the stuff doesn't automatically make modern AVGN bad, the same way I'd like to think that bringing me on board to help with co-writing hasn't made Sarah's ad bad. So, with that in mind, are they correct? Is modern AVGN bad? I think the first time I noticed that something was up with AVGN was the chronologically confused video on Kingdom Hearts. That video is weird. There had been a few chronologically confused AVGN videos before. It's just a special episode where James, barely in character as the nerd, comments on how confusing some series can be in their titles and continuity order. It's fine and harmless enough. But the Kingdom Hearts one, man, that one was just strange. And I hope it's not just the KH fangirl nitpicker in me, because it wasn't like I took issue with anything specific that was being said, but it was just like, here was a video about Kingdom Hearts making the same jokes everyone has been making about Kingdom Hearts for the past decade. Oh, the titles are confusing. Oh, there's so many games and it's hard to tell what order to play them in. Oh, the story is so complicated, and it's like, yeah. Everyone has made this video already. The thing that turned it into the bizarre was James' admittance in the first minute of the video that he hadn't played any of the Kingdom Hearts games, and then him talking about all of the Kingdom Hearts games, giving the most basic general Wikipedia-style descriptions of everything. It was the first time I was fully aware of the fact that James had co-writers, and the first time I noticed things felt off. That's not to say James needs to play or personally experience everything referenced on the channel. When I write with Sarah, I'll occasionally write in parts about Twin Peaks or Dragon Ball Z, and Sarah just has to sit there and read it aloud as if they know what they're talking about. It just sort of happens. But I guess what made it stand out here was that this wasn't a throwaway reference or a tiny part of a much bigger thesis, but James admitting in the script that he hadn't engaged with the primary subject of the video. And more than anything, it felt kind of lazy. Like, why did this video even exist if James hadn't played any of the games? The answer to that was obvious. The video came out January 2019, just a few days before Kingdom Hearts 3 released. It was a video thrown together in order to capitalize on the release of a highly anticipated game in the hopes of drawing in views. And I can't blame the hustle, but I can wish the hustle was a little better, especially since the first Kingdom Hearts could make an honestly really interesting AVGN episode, what with it being a 20-year-old action JRPG with a lot of silly moments and wonky mechanics. I mention all of this because I think it was after this point where I, as a fan, began to really change the way that I looked at and approached AVGN videos. I didn't hate them or anything. It wasn't like I suddenly had a violent disgust towards their existence. I still don't, really. If I had to compare modern AVGN to anything, it would be modern-day Simpsons. Modern-day Simpsons episodes aren't usually terrible. Chances are that you can throw one on and be decently entertained enough as mindless filler content. But I don't really go out of my way to watch Modern Simpsons either. I don't patiently await every episode, and I'm not sitting there Sunday nights tuning in every week, and even though Modern Simpsons episodes are easily available via streaming now, I'm probably more than likely just going to go back and rewatch the older stuff. Modern Simpsons isn't something I'd mind having on if I come across it, but it isn't anything immediately engaging, and it certainly doesn't live up to the standards of what was once groundbreaking and genre-defining material. The problem with describing why AVGN has gotten worse, though, is that it can feel hard to fully diagnose what the problem is now. With something like Nostalgia Critic, you had a very clear format change and shift into the prioritization of sketch comedy over film reviews, as well as a clear delineation point of pre-demo reel and post-demo reel that you could point out and say, yes, this is where it gets bad. But the nerd doesn't really have that beyond just looking at when Screenwave joined. And that's not even an easy enough guide because, unlike Nostalgia Critic, it's not as if the nerd format has changed all that significantly since the beginning either. Theoretically, he's using the same structure he's always had. So then it becomes a question of what the nerd should be and what a standard high-quality nerd episode is supposed to look like. Is AVGN about a guy who yells at games where the humor is derived by his yells and swears? Is it a review show that focuses on showcasing the flaws in shitty video games where the humor is derived on how bad the review subject is? Is it an essay series dedicated to showcasing gaming history and exploring potentially forgotten things of the past, both the good and bad? Is it a series where each episode acts as a short film in which we see James Rolfe play a nerd character who gets involved in plots related to the game he's playing? Angry Video Game Nerd has been all of these things, often at the same time, alternating episode to episode. It's at the point where identifying what AVGN as a series is or its main appeal acts more like a Rorschach test than it does a straight-up summary. Everyone has their own preference for what a nerd episode should be. Personally speaking, I can say that I don't really like the skit-heavy episodes of AVGN, and never have, but that I do enjoy the ones where he just goes more in depth over certain topics rather than just covering one bad game. This is, of course, going to make writing for a nerd episode incredibly hard, because ultimately it's up to you to decide exactly what you think the show is. And much like a Doctor Who fan becoming showrunner, it's almost inevitable that the way in which you interpret the show is going to determine the finished product. And it's important to call The Nerd a show, because that's, first and foremost, what makes all of this so complicated. The Nerd is a series, one with a main character that needs to be written. If someone joins the project as a writer, it's not just up to them to give their opinion on the games they're covering, but to write what they think the nerd's opinion would be on the game they're covering. It also creates a very limited system that you have to work in. The AVGN is a surviving monument of an almost fully dead era. The angry critic getting mad at bad media thing was dominant online for a while because it was what people at the time thought was the most compelling and fascinating content. People wanted to see someone tear into bad video games or movies because seeing someone make fun of something is fun, and it's also a good easy gateway into being funny. But around 2012 and 2013, there was a dramatic shift in how online gaming content was presented. I'd argue that it split into two categories. The first are those most directly descended from the type of content James created. Let's consider them the personality-based video reviewer. Around this time, this genre of online video began to undergo a process that I can only really describe as normal bootsification, where people realized that they could still review games no matter if they were good or bad, while showing a range of emotions, so long as they managed to make the final result funny and adopt appealing personas. Angry was out, wacky was in. This is where you get a lot of modern video game reviewer personalities like Scott the Woz, or The Completionist, or Ant Dude, or current era Kadikarus, who can do the whole look at this bad game I found thing, but for the most part have adopted a sense of humor built more upon an over-the-top yet casual and generally positive persona, rather than emphasizing just how angry the game made them and how much they hated. The other category of game critic that arose were game essayists. Channels like Super Bunny Hop and Matthew Matosis came onto the scene and proved that you could do long-form, informative critical game analysis without needing to rely solely on humor and a reviewer persona, and more importantly, that people would respond, be generally invested in that sort of thing. This is content we still see today as part of the wider video essay trend, of which I am a part of. Hello. This gives creators the power to talk about a wider variety of subject matter, spotlighting games they like a lot or think are overlooked, or even just focusing on themes that they want to highlight or comment on. Some can even get the freedom to not talk about games at all if they wanted to. The era of marketing yourself solely by the one type of media you review is essentially over. The world is your oyster, you crazy-ass video essayist you. Generally speaking, online gaming content made today is going to fall into one of these two categories, with some managing to thread the needle between the two. And then you have angry video game nerd, which can't fit into either classification. It's right there in the name. He's the angry video game nerd. He reviews video games and he gets angry at them. Any attempt to deviate from that format would mean that you're no longer making an angry video game nerd video, which means you have to find ways to replicate that format to capture its essence to maintain the same energy that drove the character 15 years ago. But how possible is that, really? Part of what made early AVGN feel so fun was how much it was clear that James was drawing off his own memories, his own childhood, and his own experiences with these games. But eventually you reach a limit on that, right? There's only so many games one encounters in their childhood, only so many old games that are terrible, and only so many things worth being mad about. I think this is what people really mean when they get upset about James not being the sole writer or worrying about him not playing games anymore. It's because there's a certain thing missing from these new episodes. The sense that anything James is covering is something that he has any real interest or personal stakes in at all. It's easy to go through a list of releases and find a bad retro game and put it in and play it and notice how bad the graphics or controls are or whatever. But if you start approaching things solely from the perspective of needing to find something wrong with them and figuring out how to script freakouts, you're eventually going to start hitting diminishing returns as the well dries up more and more. I think there's a reason why the two most commonly praised recent AVGN episodes are Earthbound and Majora's Mask. Rather than dig through garbage to find some 30-year-old game that nobody remembers that has the same issues that every other game from that era does, these videos were instead attempts to look at two games considered classics and chronicle James' feelings and experiences with them. And I wonder what the channel would look like if more videos like that were allowed to exist. Because right now it's a lot of relatively obscure titles where James plays it for a little bit, describes some metaphor for a turd, and then screams, and then it's over. I've been focusing mainly on the writing issues with modern AVGN, but honestly there are issues with the production of it too. Going back to different ideas regarding what a nerd episode should look like, one of the biggest points of contention amongst those on Cinemassacre Truth is how current AVGN episodes are shot. For one thing, the setup has gotten a lot simpler. Most episodes nowadays usually use only one or two shot setups, with the one used a majority of the time a single unchanging angle of the nerd sitting on his couch. Once again, my own bias is going to betray me here, as the other videos I work on are literally just a single shot of a person sitting on a couch holding a mug and talking to you about random shit for a few hours. I'm not one to suddenly demand complicated cinematography in my online content, because ultimately I feel like what the content is trying to say is often most important. But in this case, it is interesting to compare old AVGN cinematography to now. Even simpler episodes used to have a lot more variance in their shots, a lot more visual gags, a lot more inserts, and just generally more. James would release a video in August 2021 to address complaints over the more simple shooting style, saying that a part of it was that the simplified lighting and camera work helped him to film episodes more efficiently and get more done. This video is actually pretty infamous amongst Cinemassacre Truth users, mainly because James starts out by saying he's making it to respond to comments of the asshole-ish variety, and also because James showed off his setup where he created a custom rig to zip tie his lights and mic to the ceiling in order to minimize the amount of tripods taking up floor space, which, sure, I guess. The floor space of the AVGN set is actually really interesting because I think this, more than the camera angles, has been the main thing that's been hurting the show. The Nerd has had a variety of sets so far, and by sets I mean wherever James has set up a media room in his house. That's pretty common for YouTubers. It's rare to have a dedicated set space completely independent of your living quarters. The most recognizable Nerd set, though, has to be the basement that he used for a while, but apparently a few years ago, James moved houses, and instead of setting up another media room to serve as the Nerd's filming space, he instead built a set in his garage meant to resemble the previous basement. And as far as replicating the look of it, he did a really good job. But the scale is different. Like, vastly different. It's way smaller. Really, really small. Like, no wonder he has such difficulty moving around his tripods and shit. There looks like barely enough room to do anything but walk. Why not make that set bigger, or keep it on another property, or just use a regular room, or rent out a set space? Maybe this is a nitpick, but it does affect the greater whole of the episode. With the space being so cramped, the videos feel cramped and congested. Add in the simple and repetitive nature of the camera work meant to do only the bare minimum, and it all ends up with these videos feeling kind of disposable. If the writing isn't doing a good job making the videos feel important, and the cinematography is set up more based on routine than anything else, then what makes this worth watching? That's not to say that there haven't been more ambitious episodes or anything like that. There have been ones with guests or green screens or skits and other sort of things, but these ones aren't really all that great either. Like, there was a period of time where basically every Nerd video had some sort of guest star, my theory being for publicity reasons. The most infamous one being the Life of Black Tiger review having Gilbert Gottfried in it playing Fred Fucks, which a lot of people just found distracting and annoying. Like, not only has Black Tiger as a game been covered to death, but you also had a screaming Gilbert Gottfried there for seemingly no reason but to scream and to be added to the thumbnail. There was the Immortal review, which was notable for being done all in one take, which is legitimately impressive from a filmmaking standpoint, but also meant that the format overshadowed the actual review itself. I didn't internalize anything about the game, nor am I quite sure why it needed to be shot in one take. Then there was stuff like the Shrek video, which was mostly just a skit about the Nerd being kidnapped by a Shrek cult that recites decades-old Shrek memes, which was I don't want to use cringe, but it kind of felt a little like that. And then there's stuff like the Las Vegas episode filmed in front of a bunch of green screens, which is just... After I did the demo reel video, I've developed a dislike for online reviewers doing comedy bits in front of green screens. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that recently, even attempts to do something beyond the simple format have also been really not that great and seem to be missing the mark. As I was writing the script, the 200th episode of AVGN came out, and I sort of took a step back to watch it and see how it would go. I mean, they had been hyping this up since last October, all the writing and preparation James had been doing, to the point of him being absent from some Cinemassacre videos because of it. They had been promoting it as this big event, and I was incredibly curious to see what it was. And it was really disappointing and underwhelming, and in a lot of respects feels like the culmination of a lot of the issues that modern AVGN has.
Everybody's heard about the nerd. Nerd, 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 nerd's the word. Nerd, 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 nerd's the word. Nerd, 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 nerd's the word. Don't you know about the nerd? Everybody knows that the nerd is the word. Surfing nerd!
So the premise of this episode is that the Nerd has to review all of the LJN games. LJN, for those not in the know, was this publishing company that primarily focused on putting out licensed games. Most of them were terrible because, well, most licensed games are terrible. But because of the fact that the AVGN mainly covered licensed games, LJN would come up pretty frequently to the point of it becoming a running gag on the channel, like they were the Nerd's arch nemesis, the big bad. Having the 200th episode be about reviewing every game they ever put out makes sense in a conceptual way, but not really in execution, because it means going through, well, every game, even the ones James had already reviewed. But rather than achieve this through a framing device of having James go back and re-review them, or just simply not covering them this time, they instead put in edited down clips from previous AVGN episodes. Yeah, the 200th episode is a clip show. There is coverage of games that James hadn't reviewed yet, but those parts are edited in simultaneously with the clip show segments, making them not really stand out amongst everything else going on. Additionally, you run into the issue that reviewing every X-type videos are great in theory, but you risk the chance of running into something that you don't have that much to say about. There's a lot of parts of the video where the nerd plays the game for a minute and says, yeah, controls are weird, not sure what I'm supposed to do, and then moves on. Not much in the way of insightful commentary or even jokes. The only other thing the episode has going for it is this recurring subplot in which the nerd apparently got ownership of LJN and has to make a game now, with the joke being once again about how awful and inaccurate the Back to the Future NES game was. This could have been an interesting subplot to play with the nerd having to examine the way in which he critiques content and other people's work, and could have provided a lot of personal reflection. But instead it sort of just feels like an excuse to integrate Screenwave's video game division and make more Back to the Future jokes. And I just keep going back to this clip show thing. Like, in general, I think clip shows in an online medium are basically pointless. The only reason why clip shows were ever a thing on TV in the first place is to save on the budget and fill up production space. You could maybe try to justify it as saying that you wanted fans to be able to watch and get the full LJN experience, but you can also just make a playlist of all the AVGN videos about LJN. And to add further context to the Backlash, right before the 200th episode aired, the channel uploaded a clip compilation covering the worst SNES games the nerd reviewed, a video in which James looks back on his favorite AVGN moments, a podcast episode in which James talks about his favorite AVGN episodes, the first two parts of the 200th episode, then in between parts 2 and 3, a top 10 AVGN games destruction clip compilation, the final part of the 200th episode, and just for good measure, after the final part of the 200th episode aired, there was a clip compilation of the best AVGN moments of 2021. Counting all 3 parts of the 200th episode as individual vids, that means in the span of like a month, there were 8 uploads that were solely nerd clip compilations or retrospectives. That's absurd. It's important to note that leading up to it, they said that the 200th episode was so big that it was going to be split up and released in 3 parts. But then when they were released, each part was just 20 minutes long for a combined total of an hour, which, like, I guess that might be a long time for an AVGN episode, but also it's not really that long of a video, especially not in the grand YouTube space. Like, all the cool kids nowadays are watching 2-hour videos about dumb bullshit. An hour is nothing. And something that sticks out about this is that each 20-minute part has their own unique sponsor and sponsor segment. If I'm allowed to put on my cynical conspiracy theory hat, I would say that the videos were split up in 3 solely to fulfill sponsorship requirements and maximize profits, while the old clips were added in there to fill time and justify the existence of multiple parts. I think that's sort of what AVGN feels like nowadays. Something that exists more out of corporate and financial obligation than artistic passion, doing steps to ensure that as many videos can be put out in as simple of a format as possible. James has admitted as such. As said earlier, he said he would have stopped AVGN back in 2018 if it wasn't for Screenwave taking over a lot of the work. He's been open about the fact that AVGN is around because it's his job and it's in his best financial interest to keep it around. And I understand the hustle and grind and the need to make beneficial business decisions, but it feels like more and more recently the grind has overtaken everything else. While I don't think the newer videos are as bad as some on Cinemassacre Truth think they are, they're certainly not anything to write home about either. At one point, AVGN videos might have been some of the most revolutionary on the internet, but now they just feel like videos that go up for the sake of having a video up. Of course, if this was only about mediocre episodes, that would be one thing, but it's still not really the full picture regarding why there's so much backlash as there is. For that, you have to look at the other things that have been going on the channel. So since Screenwave has taken over, there's been a few projects that Cinemassacre has tried to start off. In the interest of gaining an overall understanding of the controversy, I think it's important that I at least touch on a little bit of these, because ultimately it will give us a better understanding of why the backlash has reached the point that it has. Because for a lot of people, these series are just as much of a sign or cause of Cinemassacre's downfall as any drop in quality in the AVGN. Especially when you consider how one of the big talking points amongst truthers is criticizing how often James talks about not having any time to do certain things for the nerd vids, which means that people might look at these side projects as taking away time that could be spent on the main popular project that people prefer more. So I guess let's jump right in with the first big Screenwave Cinemassacre product, Rental Reviews. Rental Reviews, also known as Cinemassacre Video, was a review series that originally debuted in 2018. The premise itself is pretty simple. It's James and an alternating cast of Cinemassacre/Screenwave crew talking about movies, usually in a set designed to look like an old VHS rental store with a played-for-laughs streaming device that they all work there. It's incredibly basic, freeform off-the-cuff movie review show. There's a bunch of things like this on YouTube. This is one more of them. And it doesn't really work, in my opinion. It's certainly not terrible. Like, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. But I guess when it comes to movie reviews or online criticisms, I believe it needs to be either one of two things: insightful or entertaining. And Rental Reviews doesn't really hit either of those marks. Nobody really has any interesting perspective on the films or any knowledge they can bring to the table. Conversations tend to be some form of, I liked it and thought it was cool, or I didn't like it and thought it was lame. It's important to note that for a lot of people, this was their introduction to the Screenwave crew, And it's not necessarily the best one because they really don't have charisma here. Everyone feels like they're on a different wavelength. Different forms of humor, different ideas of what the show should be, different energies they're bringing to the table. Especially the difference between the Screenwave crew and James. It seems like they're in different worlds of references and culture and maturity. It feels less like I'm watching a conversation and more like I'm watching a bunch of people waiting until it's their turn to talk. It's less friends chatting about a movie together and more co-workers hanging out in the same break room making small talk about something one of them saw the other night. I think one of the things some of you might have thought of looking at footage from this or hearing me describe the concept is that it seems very, very similar to Half in the Bag, Red Letter Media's movie review series. And yes, those similarities are certainly there. Both are offshoot movie review shows in which a group of people from a production company known for their popular character-hosted review series talk about their feelings towards films, all while using the tongue-in-cheek, deliberately shitty framing device of working at a business that deals with VHS tapes. Justin said in an AMA that the similarities are coincidental, that rental reviews came out because they already had the VHS store set and decided it should be used for something. But it does feel a bit too similar in its setup and humor, especially when you consider that a lot of the Screenwave crew are openly fans of Red Letter Media and have referenced them on rental reviews. I think comparing the two is really interesting, though, regardless of whether or not the similarities were intentional, because you can really see why Red Letter Media stuff works where rental reviews doesn't. I mean, on a basic level, you have the fact that the RLM guys are generally funnier and more charismatic and tend to have more in-depth things to say about the subject matter. But on a more practical level, then, I don't think these guys have good screen energy. The thing about RLM is that they have essentially 3 unscripted movie conversation series. There's Half in the Bag, normally hosted by just Mike and Jay, in which the two talk about a recently released film. There's Best of the Worst, which has a rotating roundtable cast, a mostly chill atmosphere, and focuses on old, bad, and obscure media. Then you have Review, which has a rotating cast of 2 people talking about mostly older, culturally important films, and analyzing their legacy, impact, and their own feelings on it. This setup works great because it allows you to tailor your watching preferences based on what sort of content or style you might be in the mood for. For example, I generally don't watch a lot of Half in the Bag these days because I personally find it to be a bit too cynical for my taste, and I don't really watch a lot of contemporary movie reviews anyway. However, if there's a review video that interests me, I'll give it a watch because I can usually expect it to have some interesting insights on a specific work that I might also be interested in. And Best of the Worst is not one I regularly watch because there's so much of it, but I can generally throw on any episode that doesn't feature Max Landis and have a good enough time if I just want something chill and low-key and occasionally really funny. Meanwhile, look at rental reviews. It jumps in subject matter so frequently. I'll go from a review of the most recent Avengers movie to a review of an 80s sci-fi classic to a shitty old B movie to literally whatever else. I'm all for creators being able to talk about whatever they feel like talking about. I mean, look at this channel and try to figure out if there's any consistent trend to what I do. But I guess the thing is that I'm not marketing this as a series the same way rental reviews was, and at the very least, I try to keep a consistent style and tone regardless of what I'm covering. But your standard rental reviews episode could be anything. It could be a mean takedown of a bad movie, or it could be a bunch of guys trying to dissect art cinema. And those are 2 very different vibes and tones, which makes it hard as a viewer to really get a sense of identity for the series. And I honestly think this is an issue for the hosts as well. Like, part of the problem is that because the subject matter shifts so often to either X thing that just came out and is relevant, or X thing that this person cares about, it means a lot of the time the people involved are just not all that invested in what they're talking about. Like, take their Avengers video, whose title makes a whole big deal about the fact that James doesn't like the Avengers movies. But the whole time in the vid, he just stands there and occasionally interjects with, "Yeah, I guess I don't find them all that interesting, I guess." Like, okay, sure, that's cool. There was only really one part of rental reviews that ever gave me any sort of reaction, and unfortunately it was psychic damage. It was this line in their Akira review.
Was Akira, I know it was big in Japan, obviously it was successful, but was it a cultural touchstone like we would look at like a Ghostbusters or something like that?
With all due respect to the deceased talent of Ghostbusters, it's a good movie. It's a great movie. This is such a dumb fucking question. Are you fucking kidding me? What the fuck are you talking about? I mean, like, what's next? Are you gonna be like, did fucking Blade Runner have the same cultural touchstone as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the movie? Anyway, rental reviews lasted for about 2 years with decent-ish view counts, mainly because for a while it was the only film-based content on the channel, and the only way to get James's opinion on things like, I don't know, the new Halloween or Godzilla movies. Eventually, though, rental reviews would have its final episode 100, in June of 2020. Apparently, the reason why it ended was because of difficulties arranging the series during COVID, which, fair, as well as a desire to create a less demanding new show. Justin did say shortly after the finale that the basic framework of rental reviews would be retooled into what would eventually become the Cinemassacre podcast. The Cinemassacre podcast is, well, exactly what it says on the tin. It's a podcast hosted by Cinemassacre, specifically James, Justin, and Ciaran. Usually. Sometimes the roster changes slightly and there will be guests or James won't be there. stuff like that. There's not really much to go in depth with here. It's just a podcast featuring Cinemassacre people. It debuted in August of 2021, and it was very much not liked. In fact, it was so much not liked that it was the thing that, after I said I wouldn't be doing this video, made me want to actually do this video, after I noticed how vocally people did not like it, and also after I watched it myself, because I too did not like it. I'm gonna get slightly mean for a second. I don't like doing this. I apologize. I need you to bear with me. The Cinemassacre podcast is the sort of content that exists solely for the sake of having content. You know that whole cliche of a bunch of guys thinking that they're really interesting people and deciding to start a podcast without having any idea of what the podcast actually is or what they have to say? Yeah, the Cinemassacre podcast is the epitome of that. There's no structure, no energy, no point. The only real consistent format thing is that they occasionally start off each episode talking about what each person has been watching or reading or playing, which is very dull because it's not really a conversation starter when the rest of the table is completely unaware of what you're talking about and do not care to know more. And then after that, they just go into a freeform discussion about whatever topic they decided to talk about, which usually isn't very interesting either. The Screenwave guys still have chemistry and charisma issues, which seems bad because Justin is essentially playing host here and is not doing a good job directing or guiding anything that's going on. James seems really checked out most of the time, with shots of him checking his phone left in on the finished version. Occasionally guests will appear on the show, but they do a poor job actually theming the episode topics around the guest. Like, they had Brad Jones guest star, and instead of having him talk about his online work or cult films or his undying loyalty to Doug Walker or anything like that, they had the episode be about movie theme park rides. Or like Scott the Woz guest starred in an episode that didn't feature James, and the topic was about ranking video game movies, with Scott openly saying that he hasn't seen half of the films they were talking about, and that he was only told the topic just before recording. And they can't even do the standard go-to podcast thing of talking about current events or responding to news stories, because besides most of them not really caring about that sort of thing, they also bulk record at least 2 episodes in a row, meaning they can't really comment on anything timely, either in the world or in the channel. It feels like the only reason the Cinemassacre podcast became a thing is that they saw other YouTube creators like Rooster Teeth have their own general About Anything podcast and a podcast set that could be used for other shows, and decided that it would be a good idea to do that themselves, and that a podcast where all you have to do is make sure the audio sounds good and then edit down a multi-camera setup with occasional graphics would be easier to make and put out than a Let's Play or a video review series or anything else of the sort. It feels like blatant channel filler, and it especially feels like channel filler if you actually look at the channel itself. For a while, the Cinemassacre podcast basically took over the entire channel. Since new episodes would release every Tuesday, and it was the thing that came out the most often, there'd frequently be periods where the channel was nothing but 5 Cinemassacre podcast episodes for every 1 nerd upload. And it didn't help matters that they eventually dropped the Cinemassacre podcast branding from the main titles. My theory, because the view counts were really low and they wanted to bump them up. So if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't be able to tell what's part of the Cinemassacre podcast and what was just a normal video unless it was something incredibly blatant like a new AVGN episode. And yeah, the view counts on this thing were pretty low. Episodes frequently struggled to get beyond the 200k barrier, with most episodes being around the 150,000 view level. That may sound good on paper, but you have to remember that this is a popular channel with 3.5 million subscribers. That's around 4% of the subscriber base actually watching. That's shockingly low, even for non-AVGN content. Okay. So let's go to the next Cinemassacre project, and perhaps the most interesting one. So one of the things James started doing during the pandemic was that he set up an 80s rock and video game music parody cover band named Rex Viper, in which James plays rhythm guitar. James had wanted to do a band for years, apparently, specifically to do live performances, but the pandemic had finally given him enough time and drive to sit down and officially start recording music. The goal of Rex Viper is apparently to provide something called montage music. Essentially what they do is to take a famous song from the 80s, so far ones used in films at the time, and combine them with video game themes and references. At the time of this writing, 4 Rex Viper songs and music videos have been released, and they've done 1 live show performance at the convention Too Many Games. It's clear that this is something James is really passionate about, that it's a side project that he cares a lot for, and he's putting a lot of energy and effort into, and for that I commend him and support him. I don't understand why anyone would listen to this. Like, look, I'm not a demographic that was going to like Rex Viper. I don't really like cover bands, and I think video game song parodies are some of the most boring, overplayed, preteen form of humor out there. And that's not even getting into how wiped out I am on 80s brand nostalgia. This band is specifically designed to be as unappealing to me as possible, but even if I try to ignore all of my biases and look at it on its own merits, this is just bad. If we look at it from the perspective of a cover band, it sounds like shit. I'm not even an audio expert, if it's not obvious from listening to any one of my videos, and the mix is straight up bad. Everything is so crushed together to where nothing stands out, like it all just sounds like one mushy audio track. The band performs each song really up-tempo, likely to give each song a more rock edge and sense of energy, but honestly just comes off as if they're rushing and playing this way by accident. It sounds really sloppy. It's not even getting to the lead singer, constantly trying to go way, way, way outside of his vocal range and producing a lot of screeches and cracks that honestly really hurt my ears.
Went the distance, now I'm back on my feet. Just a man and his will to survive.
Why is he doing this? I'm legitimately concerned for its vocal cords. I'm not joking. I'm not being mean. If these guys are going to keep doing this, he needs to take better care of his voice. If you look at it from the perspective of a video game parody novelty band, then it sort of still doesn't work. Because unlike other bad video game music projects like Starbomb, there's not really an attempt at a joke or clever gag with anything here. It's just inserting melodies or references to video games inside other songs. What if Eye of the Tiger was about Tiger Electronic Games? What if Mighty Wings from Top Gun was crossed over with Street Fighter 2? There's no real punchline. The sheer act of nerd inclusion is supposed to be the entire appeal. And because of that, Rex Viper comes off as honestly incredibly dated. Like, perhaps if Rex Viper came out in the early 2010s, the era before the Ready Player One backlash began and video game and nerd references were still a fun novelty, it would actually be an appealing project. But the fact is, we're in the 2020s. Nerd culture has officially entered the mainstream, and retro obsession has been corporatalized and Funko popped to death. Maybe it's just a personal thing, but that sort of stuff isn't really all that appealing anymore. James Rolfe described Rex Viper as workout music for nerds, which is one way to describe it. Personally, I describe it as music for someone who thinks the best part of Scott Pilgrim is when they play the Zelda theme at the beginning, but I digress. And not to be rude, but why is Justin in the band? Like, he's just sort of standing there in all the videos and performances. I know he's credited as management and backing vocals, but I can never actually hear him in any of the mixes, and even in the live show when he was slightly more audible, I couldn't necessarily get any sense of harmony or any sign that he's an especially good vocalist. He doesn't play an instrument, he's just standing there. Why is he on stage with the band? Rex Viper has proven to be incredibly, incredibly unpopular. It's interesting because you can actually numerically track the growing dislike towards Rex Viper and Cinemassacre as a whole by looking at the gradual changing of the like to dislike ratio with each video, culminating in the most recent Rex Viper vid, their live performance, having close to 50% dislikes. This is not a well-liked project at all. That doesn't mean it doesn't have defenders, but there's something really interesting about positive Rex Viper comments. It's that they aren't really all that positive at all. If anything, I'd call them more supportive than positive. Generally, if you see someone defending Rex Viper or being nice towards it, they're going to be saying something like, I'm glad James is having fun with a project he's interested in. Looks like everyone's having a good time. Which is like, yeah, I'm glad that James is branching out and trying new things, and I want him to do projects he enjoys. I fully support him trying out new creative endeavors with his friends. Of course I do. So with that in mind, I hope I can phrase this next part without sounding like an asshole. James Rolfe isn't our friend, and we shouldn't be treating him and his projects as if he is. It's one thing to be supportive of a creator that you like and want them to do things that make them happy, but it's another thing to talk about their work like they're a buddy of yours doing a hobby you support. James is a 40-year-old man who has been in the media creation business for close to 20 years now. He is a professional, he should be used to putting his work out there, and honestly deserves to have that work treated with respect, and respect is very different from blind support and encouragement. I mean, I've only been doing this for a few years now, and if I worked hard on a creative project and released it out to the public, and the biggest point of praise from my fan base or even just a stranger that I could get in response was, I'm glad you had fun making it, I would interpret that as meaning what I had put out was a failure. I know you can add another counterpoint here, that this is just a fun hobby for James and the others to do over quarantine and you shouldn't be too harsh to it. I mean, even the description for the first Rex Viper song says it's just for fun. And you know, that's fair. Like, I also do things like make shitty drawings and write shitpost fanfictions for fun. It's nice to have a creative hobby, and I would hate for someone to look up my AO3 account and put my fics through the same level of scrutiny as they would one of my vids here. Which is why I don't promote, spotlight, or market my creative hobbies the same way I do my actual professional pursuits and projects, so that the expectation, in return, is different. And this is where we have to face the fact that Rex Viper isn't just a fun side hobby. The videos are uploaded and monetized on the main channel. They sell their songs. They have official merch you can buy. They did an entire live show at a gaming convention that they highly promoted and publicized. And that's not even taking into account things like Mike Matei explaining that one of the reasons he left Cinemassacre was that James was wanting to focus more on music, or the sheer amount of money that would need to be invested to pay for the production of their videos, live show crew members, and just general management fees. This isn't me being an asshole to someone who decided to try and make sourdough bread during the pandemic. This is someone who decided to try and make sourdough bread for the first time in their life during the pandemic, and then decided after making it once that they were going to start their own bakery. The moment that starts being a fully professional for-profit pursuit, the standards upon which I have to look at it changes. And I want to talk about that live performance. Last October, Rex Viper made their live debut at Too Many Games, a gaming convention operated by Screenwave. The show was widely hyped up and promoted by Cinemassacre and James, and in the weeks leading up was a frequent discussion point on the Cinemassacre podcast. Finally, the show happened, an official recording of it was placed up on the Cinemassacre Clips channel, and it is really, really hard to sit through. Really, really hard. Besides Rex Viper's usual problems, you have individual band members getting off tempo, instruments sounding out of tune, the lead guitarist playing the wrong chords, the vocalist continuing to try to sing way beyond his limits, and in general, just a lot of really sloppy mistakes. The thing is that not only was this their first live performance together, but the band had never met in person, let alone practiced together until 3 days before the concert. And it shows. It really, really shows. This is where I have to go back to the professional standards thing, because while, yes, I can tell that James and the rest really enjoyed themselves up there and seemed to be having a good time, this is also a show they did at a relatively popular convention that people paid money to attend. You'd expect something more polished than this. And I think the thing that gets me is that the only reason they had that opportunity and were able to do that performance is because James is popular and because Screenwave organizes the convention. There are almost certainly other bands out there doing what Rex Viper is doing and have put in more time and work who would benefit more from having that stage than a band with only 4 released songs that had never even practiced in person before. And maybe that's harsh, but it's the truth. Rex Viper would not succeed on its own merits. Any opportunity or support it has garnered is purely through James being the angry video game nerd. And that's something really interesting when you look at Rex Viper and all of these projects, really. Despite James and Cinemassacre's attempt to branch out beyond just AVGN, this is honestly the most James-reliant the channel has felt in a while. Rex Viper's whole thing is using the same type of 80s video game nostalgia as The Nerd, frequently picking the exact same subjects, like their Power of Love cover being another excuse to joke about the Back to the Future NES game not being movie accurate, or even the Tiger Electronics music video starts out with a monologue of clips from the Tiger Electronics episode of AVGN, including showing where he made the exact same joke and sang a parody of Eye of the Tiger. I mean, the name Rex Viper even came from a recurring AVGN character. And then there's just the whole spotlighting of James. There's quite clear moments when James is given priority attention, such as the end of the Rex Viper concert where they let him go up to the mic and give a big speech and give him a huge, big round of applause. But there's also other things. Since the Screenwave retool, basically any video that James happens to be in has an almost uniform thumbnail format, a blown-up picture of James's face in front of some generic background meant to convey the mood of the piece. Regardless of what series it is, who else is in the vid, the subject matter, they're all relying on James's face to get clicks. And that's because obviously he's the main draw of the channel, but it goes to the larger questions about what Cinemassacre really is expected to be. Is it its own production company? Or is it an outlet for James's content? Is Cinemassacre a media brand, or is it just a channel name that James uses? This might sound like a dumb question, but it's honestly something I've been thinking about, especially as it's clear that any attempts for Cinemassacre to feature other creators and video types have been rejected by the fanbase and never really caught on, and even more so when it's clear that these other projects aren't really all that good, nor seem to have everyone's full effort and attention. It's easy to look at what's going on, the low viewer numbers, the growing amount of dislikes, and the angry fan comments, and blame it solely on an entitled audience, and yeah, a fair bit of it is that. But there's also compelling arguments that Screenwave and the current Cinemassacre crew are just dropping the ball on a lot of these, and it's only served to amplify the current criticism and hate. And if that sounds like hyperbole, then allow me to tell you about the time when Screenwave really, really, really screwed something up. For years, one of the more notable series that James Rolfe did, besides The Angry Video Game Nerd, was Monster Madness. Initially, starting in 2007, the format of Monster Madness was really simple. They were short-form horror reviews James would release every day during the month of October, meant to introduce these movies to more people and imitate old monster movie marathons that would occur back in the olden days. Each year would have a different main subject, with one year focusing on Godzilla films, and one year focusing on sequels, and one year focusing on 80s movies, etc., etc. Despite the videos being pretty simple, the series has a really devoted fan base and was always amongst the most anticipated Cinemassacre content. A large part of it was that it was clearly a passion project for James, giving him an out-of-character outlet to simply gush about films that he clearly cares a lot about. There's not much insightful commentary to them, but there didn't really need to be. It would mainly just be James summarizing the plot and then giving some details and his overall thoughts on the movie. Early Monster Madness is legit a good, simple time. But it was always a series that would have to struggle with its format. For starters, it meant prepping 31 videos for daily release, which requires a lot of planning and backlog building, but more importantly, it also used a lot of film clips, often explicit ones too, because of the horror subject matter, which would frequently cause conflict with copyright checks and age restrictions. That stuff is annoying on normal videos, but especially when it's part of an extended marathon and you don't really have the time to deal with battling the YouTube system or revising individual videos to get around that sort of thing. So as the years went on, Monster Madness began to take other forms, including just using still frames from the movies, and eventually a shift to a very unpopular, unscripted, off-the-cuff talk show format, with Monster Madness now seeming to be specialized theme episodes of rental reviews. People were very, very vocally not pleased. But then 2021 was the year when things would be turned around. A little bit of background, the Cinemassacre website, which used to host a lot of videos and its own content, at one point in time eventually went down, becoming nothing more than a page that led to a bunch of links to other Cinemassacre social media platforms, because websites are basically just link dumps nowadays. Screenwave would put out statements on how they were working on a site redesign and would have one out eventually, and it was decided that the thing to celebrate the grand reopening of the Cinemassacre site would be to reboot Monster Madness the way it used to be. Daily uploads, actual clips being used, the works. Because it was all going to be hosted on the site, they didn't need to worry about any YouTube restrictions or anything that could hurt it algorithmically. The theme for the year was going to be around the world, showcasing horror films from various different countries. The series would be kicking off on October 1st with a review of the British horror film 28 Days Later. October 1st. Man, what a fucking day. I had driven 8 hours to go see the Dear Evan Hansen movie in theaters with a friend, and when I got there and could finally check my phone, I got notifications that Channel Awesome had started teasing more demo reel content, and that there was a big controversy with Monster Madness, and both of those things made my gut drop, because I knew at some point I was going to have to talk about them. I had already been planning this video anyway, and this just complicated the whole fucking thing. So, the 28 Days Later review drops, and on the surface, it's a basic Monster Madness episode. James speaking over clips of the film, giving a plot description, some trivia, and ending with his thoughts on it. But a user on the Cinemassacre Truth questioned some of the phrasing and statements James said in the video, so he transcribed some parts and searched them up and saw that a fair chunk of the vid was plagiarized from a 2003 review of 28 Days Later, written by Cecilia Siad for the website Film Connect, with some parts either slightly changed or straight up basically the same.
28 Days Later is set in a post-apocalyptic Britain, which has been devastated by an epidemic that within seconds can transform its victims into crazed cannibal killers. The movie starts with the usual tropes. Mankind's experiments go haywire, resulting in destructive results. The epidemic begins with chimps infected with rage. The film then cuts to a young man named Jim, played by Cillian Murphy, who's also known as the villain in Wes Craven's Red Eye and the Scarecrow in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Following a car accident, he wakes up from a 28-day coma. Finding the hospital abandoned, he walks out and wanders through the empty London streets. He finds that people have fled the country after the outbreak, but those who remain are either dead or have become the infected. And it's with these survivors that Jim will struggle to stay alive with. Selena, played by Bond and Pirates actress Naomi Harris, Frank, played by Brendan Gleeson, and his teenage daughter Hannah, played by Megan Burns. The group sleeps in debris of deserted buildings, eats canned food from abandoned supermarkets, and fights off the infected, while 28 Days Later aligns itself with the typical loss of individuality plot, much like in the 80s remakes of The Thing and The Fly. Once an individual's infected, their humanity is gone, and they become something more animal-like. Very haunting to say the least, the movie began shooting on September 1st, 2001. We all know what happened so shortly after, and when seeing the film today and being put into that time period, you can't help but think of 9/11 and all those TV images of Ground Zero and Baghdad being devastated by war. But much like our heroes at the end of Day of the Dead, there's the possibility of renewal. The survivors fight with their heart and soul for an attempt to start over. So we leave the film with hope. There's a dark and light, and perhaps an endless cycle where order is born from chaos, and then chaos is born from order.
Word of this quickly began to spread, and people were trying to figure out exactly what happened and demanding some form of answer. Well, see, people actually sort of knew the answer. In the weeks leading up to Monster Madness, a Cinemassacre contributor named Newt talked on Twitter about how he had written 20 out of the 31 Monster Madness episodes, so people assumed that it was him who wrote it, but they weren't quite sure yet. Cinemassacre's early response was swift and professional, and by that I mean they started deleting comments left on the video that would bring up the plagiarism. This escalated when people found the early backend upload for the second Monster Madness episode that year, a review of the New Zealand film Bad Taste, which also featured a fair amount of lines that were plagiarized, this time from an article on the site Screen Age Wasteland. People, once again, got more upset until finally Justin acknowledged what was going on. First saying that there was a new, unnamed Cinemassacre helper who mixed up the notes in a decade-old script James wrote and that it was a fuck-up, but they just go ahead and redo that one video. Then a bit later, Justin clarified in a DM, as well as a comment on the Cinemassacre Truth, that Newt was in fact the person responsible, that he did have a hand in 20 plus vids, but did heavy lifting on 3 of them, restated the thing of old notes getting mixed in with a decade-old James script, and saying that so far, they had to reduce 6 Monster Madness videos to account for plagiarism. Both the videos were taken down, with Justin putting a note under the 28 Days Later video saying that it needed to be fixed because of some accidental plagiarism, which sure is a phrase, I guess. The idea that Justin was originally proposing here was that some sort of error caused plagiarism to happen by mistake somehow, that quotes that might have been taken from sources they wanted to cite or were there for research purposes got placed in the script just out of confusion regarding what was a quote and what was something James wrote. But if that was the case, why were some of the lines rewritten using the same plagiarism avoidance techniques that high school students use when writing essays? Cinemassacre Truth users began looking into this more and more and seeing what other examples they could find. There was one case in which AVGN Blu-ray box art might have been plagiarized from a fan artist on DeviantArt, though personally I could see this being a coincidence as they're both Doom parodies. They found a video in which Newt said that he directly lifted lines from Dracula to put into a shark movie he wrote. They found clips from an old AVGN roast that Newt participated in back in 2013, where he used jokes taken from other people like Amy Schumer and John Stamos, which are good things to pull from. Good choices there. And then in the midst of all this controversy, writer Catherine Despira got on Twitter and talked about how the AVGN episode covering Pelobius was plagiarized using research, images, and info that were exclusively in a 2012 article posted to Catherine's website and Retrocade magazine, without Cinemassacre citing the source that they were retrieved from. Though that might not fit the general sense of plagiarism as everything else, and is more of a conversation about how YouTubers don't think to cite their sources the same way actual academics and reporters do, it still got pulled into this controversy and became a talking point. Finally, James spoke up and addressed what happened, weirdly enough in an unlisted video hosted on the Cinemassacre Clips side channel rather than putting it directly on the main feed. In it, James explained that he would write portions of the Monster Madness scripts and then hand them out to others to fill with the sort of trivia and research gathered from sites like IMDb and Wikipedia and whatever they thought was interesting. And while James doesn't name him, he says that Newt copy and pasted other people's writing there, and James had no idea when he went to record the voiceover. In the days after, the 28 Days Later episode was redone and re-uploaded, and Newt and Cinemassacre parted ways, seemingly not on good terms based on how everyone has talked about it since. I think the thing about this is that on a certain level, James and Justin and the rest of the Screenwave people handled this as best as they could. They took the time to find out what happened, took the videos down, fired the person responsible, and redid the content that was plagiarized. I'll give them credit for that. A lot of this wasn't their fault. But it does raise a lot of worry and suspicion regarding the effectiveness of their whole operation. Like the initial explanation here being that James was using 10-year-old scripts and having other people edit in research and trivia and fleshing them out. That's wild to me. Reviews are some of the most context-sensitive writing out there. So much of what you're going to say about a movie is going to be dependent on what the world is like when you're writing those words and what you're like while writing those words. I can't imagine making a review out of 10-year-old notes. Even when I made my demo reel video, I rewatched the series and basically completely disregarded the notes I made 2 years prior because I needed something fresher and that more captured who I was and what I cared about at the time that I was doing the video. And the whole thing is really emblematic of a lot of the problems people have with the current Cinemassacre operation. Monster Madness started as James's passion project, his way of expressing his love for horror cinema, but now here it was, with the majority of it being written by other people filling in blanks using 10-year-old notes and one person just straight up copying and pasting, and James not being in the loop enough to know that it happened before he went and did the voiceover and handed it over to someone else to edit. And I know I defended the use of co-writers in general earlier, but the most complicated thing about Monster Madness is the quantity of it. The videos themselves are plot summaries and small bits of trivia and personal feelings. The average video lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 minutes. I can get how a team can be helpful with this, especially with things like editing, but the whole setup made Monster Madness that year feel less like a labor of love and more like content being driven down the content assembly line. Videos composed of old notes and trivia from IMDb just to fill up space in it, even though IMDb trivia is notoriously garbage. And here's the thing about plagiarism. It's something basically everyone can agree is bad. I've never seen a concept that unifies more people online. Remember when we found out Gene Simmons' son plagiarized Bleach and anime fans all stopped their bickering for a moment to make fun of it? And plagiarism is especially bad if you're a critic or a journalist or a reviewer, because then your words and your opinions are the things that you're selling yourself with. People are expecting you to give your honest view of what you're talking about. They're putting their trust in you to give them insight and information, and plagiarism is a violation of said trust. Because besides just being scummy to the people you're stealing from, it also means that anything you say or write from that point on is going to be in question. It was hard for people to enjoy the rest of the 2021 Monster Madness episodes because it became impossible to watch them without wondering, in the back of your head, whether or not any of this was taken from somewhere else. And that's not good when you're marketing yourself as a critic. I know the plagiarism scandal wasn't all their fault and that there is a specific person who did this and they did what they could to counteract it. But it's definitely a notable stain on the videos and puts the current Screenwave writing and creating process into question. You hire a company like Screenwave to help make the job easier for you. But if what they're doing is providing you with untrustworthy talent and getting you involved in various controversies, then is it really that good of a partnership? So with that in mind, now that we're all up to speed, now that we're done with all the controversy, the drama, the build-up, now that we have all this info and understanding of what has been going on, it's time to ask ourselves, is the Cinemassacre backlash justified? The Cinemassacre backlash is an interesting thing because the more I look into it, the more I can see why it happened. And the more I look into Cinemassacre content, the more I began to agree with some of it. But also the more I looked into it, the more I realized the current wave of backlash is honestly sort of absurd and not really deserved at all, not at the current levels at least. I need to put some words down about the Cinemassacre Truth subreddit. I've referenced them a lot in this video, the research that they would do, their origins, their anger towards Cinemassacre members, and the role they play in the current backlash. And I did that because it was necessary to do so in order to explain everything going on and touch on why exactly people are mad. But it wouldn't be fair for me to just parrot everything they say without actually looking at what they're saying or adding my own thoughts on their side of things as well. And this is where I have to admit that as a whole, I don't really like the Cinemassacre Truth. I share a lot of their frustrations with the current channel. I can respect some of the investigative work they've done and fully support people venting about their displeasure towards online media. I mean, I'd be a huge hypocrite if I wagged my finger here and said, "What are you complaining about? It's free content. You're not allowed to criticize it." But I guess the thing is that for every post full of valid criticism or pointing out a legitimate thing that a Cinemassacre member did wrong, there's just a lot of mean shit. Really disheartening shit. A lot of body shaming, a lot of transphobia, a lot of name calling, personal attacks, a lot of vitriol, and just this general sense of unpleasantness. People made fun of James for saying that there have been a lot of comments of the asshole-ish variety, saying that it's bad of him to call people with legitimate criticism assholes. But let's not pretend as if there haven't been people actually being assholes right now. People who have become so invested in chronicling the lows of Cinemassacre that it starts to actually consume them and rile them up to the point where they essentially have deep-seated hatred towards James. I understand how this happens. Like, in a way, it's very similar to something that Sarah and I talked in our video about the McElroy brothers we did last year. Much like the McElroys, James Rolfe has for a while been seen as a prominent, pioneering, and wholesome figure that has a strong fan base who love him unconditionally and view him fully as unproblematic. Because of this, it's easy to fall in the trap of going in that opposite direction, where instead of parasocial ideation, you fall into parasocial hatred. You begin viewing the figure under an always negative light, where everything they do must be framed through the most uncharitable interpretation possible. There's also another side of how a parasocial lens affects this. If you're someone who did have a parasocial ideation of James and James's work, then you put him on a heavenly pedestal. But if someone does something to fall from grace in your eyes, well, it's a long fall from heaven. Your response is almost assuredly going to be worse because you now have to deal with the reality of a fallen idol. And that's when you also flip into parasocial hatred. There's this term called bitch eating crackers that I think is really interesting. It's when you have such strong negative feelings about someone that everything they do suddenly irritates you and upsets you, even if the thing in question is just them sitting down and eating crackers. That's the zone it feels like a lot of these people currently mad at James are in. There's a lot of hatred for James on the sub that goes beyond just being disappointed about his videos or his output. It oftentimes gets weirdly personal. Like, I've seen posts on there that are basically people writing elaborate fanfiction about how James's wife must be abusing him and stating that his kids are going to grow up and be ashamed of him, and it's like, you realize that what you're mad about right now isn't James the actual person, but James the idea that exists in your head, right? And that all of this anger and rage is mostly because James started making videos you found disappointing. I think some of the best evidence of this sort of attitude has happened fairly recently. On January 28th, James released a new video on the channel entitled VHS Memories and What Nostalgia Means to Me, and it's honestly the best Cinemassacre video in a while. It's not necessarily treading any new ground if you've been a long-term fan of James, but the video, an exploration of James's VHS room and his history with the format, has a certain level of heart and charm to it that's been missing. You get to see James go through his memories of recording films as they aired on TV at night, not being sure exactly what he was going to record, his memories of walking down video stores, discovering old monster movies. He has so much passion for this, and it shows. And that's not even getting into the finer details, like how this video doesn't have a sponsorship, and how it has multiple camera angles, and how James is the only person in it. It honestly feels like a genuine attempt to respond to some of the criticism that the channel has accumulated. And then in an update James posted, he said that he plans to release more scripted content like this throughout the year, from movie reviews to gaming videos to just stuff over other topics he wants to talk about. And also with the update came other interesting news, mainly that the increase in focus to scripted content meant that the Cinemassacre podcast was cancelled, and that while Screenwave will still be involved in production processes like producing and editing, there's language here that suggests that they might not be making on-screen appearances and will be focusing their time elsewhere instead. And not to be rude, but yeah, that's a good call. It clearly wasn't working out there. I wish them the best on their individual journeys, but I do think this is a step in the right direction. So here we have essentially actions meant to address many of the complaints people have been having. James making a video on his own about a topic he's legitimately invested in, the promise of more scripted content rather than freeform off-the-cuff things, podcasts being cancelled with Screenwave seemingly no longer appearing on camera. This is overall a good direction to go in, and you would think that it would satisfy the people of Cinemassacre Truth. And it did. For a day. Until suddenly it was back to business, and then the subreddit was essentially split into two camps, with one side being in favor of the vid, and one side still openly insulting James, still making the same jokes about Screenwave, still making fun of the recent video for apparently being lazy. For a large group of people, it doesn't actually matter what actions are taken by Cinemassacre, because they've immersed themselves so firmly in a pessimistic and cynical view of the channel and James that they don't really seem to be willing to get out of, especially if it means getting to repeat and reuse the same jokes and memes they've been using. Some of the memes that I've taken off there have never really sat right with me, if I'm being totally honest. The whole stuff of getting onto James for saying he has a little time is like, yeah, I get it, he says that a lot. And yeah, there are probably ways he could utilize his time better, but I also fully believe him when he says he's low on time. Creating is very time-consuming. Running a business is very time-consuming. Having a family and raising kids is very time-consuming. And also all the jokes about James's kids and how often he talks about them and explains that he has to spend time with them, like, yeah, that's fine to me. Like, I know the thing that a lot of people say is that most people work a 9-to-5 desk job that they have to do every day and that they manage to balance work and their home life. But I guess the thing is that James is still putting out content of debatable quality, mind you, but we don't have any proof that he's just sitting around doing nothing. And furthermore, I'm not going to blame a man who is going to prioritize spending time and being there for his kids over the YouTube videos he makes online. Fatherhood is important, time is fleeting, and it's nice for him to have the privilege to be there with them as much as he possibly can. Like, in general, I think more people should be able to spend more time with their loved ones than they do on work, and I'm not going to be mad at him for being in a place where he can do that. Additionally, the people saying that James should be better at balancing spending time with his kids and his work life in comparison to a 9-to-5 desk job, who then also make fun of him for the I have to leave and go home at 5:40 thing, confuse me a bit. Because that is him asserting the same type of boundary and work balance that people seem to want from him. And honestly, good for him. The thing about creative work becoming your job is that it can often feel like you're always on the clock, especially if you're technically self-employed and do your work independently in your own residence. Having an understanding of when to switch off and what to prioritize is good. That's good. Good for him. One of the things I've noticed is that every time I mention that I'm doing this video or have teased it, I always get the same type of comments. Something along the lines of, wait, there's a Cinemassacre controversy? Or, oh, I'm scared to find out what all James did. I hope I don't have to stop watching. And it's sort of interesting, because when you actually look at the main parts of the controversy, the main things people are vocally upset about, it all seems really minor. People expect a giant change to the channel style scandal, and instead they get a bunch of complaints regarding videos not being as good anymore. And the thing about that is that there is stuff to be legitimately upset about. Things that are legit problems that should be addressed, or things that could be a valid deterrent from someone feeling comfortable with supporting Cinemassacre. The stuff Mike Matei did, Justin's edgy, asshole-ish history, the Monster Madness plagiarism scandal, these are all super reasonable things to get upset over, and I could understand a backlash about any of them. The problem is that this isn't what the current backlash is about, and we can't really pretend that it is. The Cinemassacre Truth as a name used to be a reference to controversial behaviors from Cinemassacre employees that were being silenced and disregarded by official sources. But now the truth simply means the idea that the channel isn't good anymore, which, okay, so what? The channel isn't good anymore, alright. Why does that actually matter? To any Cinemassacre Truth users who might be watching this, I say this with as much kindness and good intentions as possible. It might be time to log off. Now, hear me out. Let me explain. I've seen stuff like this happen a few times now. Things like Spoonie, classic game room, video games awesome, old school gaming personalities who get involved in controversy and start making content or choices that people don't like anymore, whose communities then transform into nothing but basically spaces for people to vent out those frustrations. But at a certain point, it always leads to those feelings being less directed at the work and more directed at the person, where you have people spending years hyperfixating on how much they don't like them anymore. And while it's good to vocalize your disappointment in something or your disapproval or talk about an actual controversy going on that you think deserves acknowledgement, there comes a time where it might be best to just stop, realize that thing isn't something you're into anymore, unsubscribe, move on to other creators you like or something new you might want to check out. There's a reality here that we have to understand. James Rolfe isn't a content machine. He's not history's greatest monster. He doesn't owe anyone anything. James is a 40-year-old man who now has a family and simply cannot, or does not want to, approach his work the same way that he used to back when he was in his 20s. That doesn't mean the work he does now is immune to any criticism. I mean, I haven't been very kind to a lot of his current output. But it also means that there's no use getting mad at him for the simple reality of a person changing over time, and more importantly, you as a viewer changing over time. When I did my demo reel video, I had a lot of thoughts and feelings and fixations on Doug Walker, and when the video was finally released, I felt a sense of catharsis. I felt that I was free from having to think about Doug all the time and having his shitty videos consume my mind. And I deliberately went out of my way to avoid doing anything remotely similar to him on the channel, not just to establish that my brand wasn't just talks about bad online media personalities, but also because I knew if I stayed in that lane, it would eventually just eat me and make me feel like a miserable person. And the thing about this video taking so long to come out is that I felt that happening to me here. Every day to research, I would have to go on both big Cinemassacre subreddits. I would have to go through web pages. I'd have to go follow the drama and any potential signs I found. And it fucking wore me down. Because in order to follow the anger and backlash, you somewhat have to get into the headspace of the backlash and the people upset, and then you start to feel upset and angry about it, and then the more you look, the longer that anger and vitriol lasts and stays in your head, and eventually I just had to stop. And when this video is out, I'll probably never look at Cinemassacre stuff in depth again. The Cinemassacre channel as a whole has gotten to the point where I don't like it. I know why I don't like it. I'm going to make this video talking about what's been happening and why I don't like it, and then I'm going to move on and focus on other things in my life, because unless something else big happens, I don't see why I would need to care about it after this point. For my own mental health, I need to unplug from thinking about this in any serious way and instead focus my attention on other things that I love and care about, because otherwise it is easy to get swallowed by it. So I hope you don't attack me over saying any of this. And I hope that at the very least you can get some space away from thinking about James or Justin or Screenwave and just do something nice for yourself, I guess. Because at the end of the day, none of this really matters. Recently, I watched that Peter Jackson Beatles documentary, Get Back. If you're not aware of what it is, basically Jackson compiled hours of old footage that was shot during the Beatles' Get Back sessions, where the band planned out what would end up being their final album and final live performance, and documents the internal strifes that came with it. It's a long but great watch, especially if you're a Beatles fan. One of the things that's really prominent, especially early on in the doc, is the dissonance in behaviors and focus on display. You have a bunch of executives and managers surrounding the band who have wide ambitions and are trying to set up deals with brands and book elaborate music video sets and figure out different things they can do to market the new performance. And then you have the Beatles themselves, who are just completely checked out from all of this, either being completely burnt out and disinterested in anything, or are focused on their own creative vision, which is significantly different than the business and marketing space that the higher-ups are trying to push them into. I think, more than anything, that's what Cinemassacre has felt like. You have James, who has mostly seemed really checked out and on the sideline for a few years now, who has fully admitted that he's only still doing the nerd for money, who seems to be devoting less and less time to scripted content, and who just seems not at all interested in online video making compared to his other pursuits like writing or music or filmmaking or fatherhood. And then you have Screenwave, who is all about trying to get James to play the YouTube algorithm game, who care a lot about maximizing uploads and sponsorship deals and doing their best to build this into a strong brand. And the thing is, it's hard to really blame them for that because that's what their job is, that's what they're supposed to do. But at the same time, it's clear that this isn't working. That prioritizing quantity over quality by pushing out more unscripted content, by assigning the nerd to a schedule that forces frequent uploads in exchange for complexity, by forcing out 1 million clip compilation videos and other channel filler for the sole reason of trying to force things out for the algorithm, they've created something that feels very hollow. The thing about James is that he was never really a YouTuber. Like, he was always first and foremost a filmmaker. And that was always one of the more appealing aspects of him, that no matter what was going on in the wider world of YouTube, James was a consistent force who didn't really care to play into the grander algorithm game or anything like it. And I think that by trying to force the content into that, they've basically ripped the heart out of the channel. There are parts of the Cinemassacre Truth and Backlash that I don't agree with, but I do think that it's clear that something has been going wrong and that the channel is in desperate need of a shakeup. And maybe there's hope that it's getting one. The revision plans for 2022 have led to more content people have been wanting to see from James. Scripted reviews of things people have been wanting James to talk about for a while, like the new Ghostbusters movie and Cobra Kai. There are seemingly attempts to address the concerns. The question is whether or not that'll be enough to quell things, or what happens from this point and what it means for Cinemassacre as a channel. Part of what makes me interested in this controversy and this subject isn't that I hate James and want to fling shit at him from across my tiny little rusty shack of a channel. It's more because I find it interesting to see how a channel from the early internet era evolved and got to this point. What do you do with something like Cinemassacre when its main appeal is part of a dying genre? The Cinemassacre channel, if we're being real for a second, isn't really in too healthy of a place from a business perspective. At least by the way you'd view a channel as healthy if your job was to diagnose the analytics of content first and foremost. The channel has slowly but surely seen a decline in overall view count and engagement. It has 3.5 million subscribers, which is a very good amount, but view numbers often don't reflect that. Nerd videos basically always break 1 million, but recently they've taken more and more time to reach that point, with the final part of episode 200 having not gotten there at the time of this recording, and in general view counts tend to stagnate at the 1 million range rather than get a lot higher. It sort of signifies that AVGN videos, at the moment, reach an initial wide influx of viewers, or about 1/3 of subscribers, and then seem to stop there and not be carried by the algorithm all that much, despite attempts to appeal strictly to that. There's a lot of reasons why this could be, though the one I keep going back to is the stuff that I said earlier regarding what modern AVGN videos feel like, which is disposable. With no real reason for people to rewatch these nor share them around with others, the main people that are going to be watching are fans giving the video an initial prominent boost and not really anyone else. This is where the dying genre thing comes into play. Every day that passes, the nerd as a character in a series become more and more outdated. There are people, teenagers, watching YouTube right now who weren't born yet when James started the series and don't remember when it was the internet show, the gaming review series. What incentive is there then for someone who has never watched AVGN before to get into a series now? Why would they do it with any of the new videos when the video subjects are getting increasingly more obscure, irrelevant, and outdated in the eyes of the general public, nor get recommended to them by fans the same way the old videos do? This isn't to say that there aren't any new AVGN fans out there. I'm just saying it's been a while since I've seen anyone ever share an episode around or tell me that it was a must-watch. I've seen more fan meme edits of older nerd clips floating around than I have any discussion or postings of anything that has been made for the channel in the last few years. Even if you want to keep the nerd around solely from a business perspective, it's going to get harder and harder and harder to keep that series at the same level of popularity it once was. This is when you start getting into conversations about ending AVGN and canceling it, but that just can't happen. As much as people online might want James to quit, the fact is that when your creative work becomes your business, you have to make business decisions. James is a man with a family and employees who rely on his income that he brings in through his work, and much like the same way that it's difficult, if not impossible, to just quit your job you hate and do something else, James can't just simply end his most popular moneymaker. And he knows this. He's basically said it. Theoretically, this is where you look at the other content on Cinemassacre to help pick up the slack. After all, you can lure people in with something a bit more modern or that appeals to a wider range of people than current AVGN does. But that also clearly hasn't been working out either. I brought up the podcast viewing numbers earlier, and really the whole channel has been like that for a while. A bunch of videos somewhere in the 100,000 to 300,000 view range, with some managing to get slightly above it. Like before, these aren't terrible numbers. Like, my channel arguably has a similar range on most videos, but we come back to the thing that this is a channel with 3.5 million subscribers. And I will acknowledge that the Cinemassacre account being so old means there's probably a lot of ancient abandoned accounts that have subscribed and kind of festered there until some bot removal happens to remove them, or just people who have been there for a while and don't feel like unsubscribing because they're not actually sure if they need to, even if they're not actually watching the videos. A lot of the reason why this non-AVGN stuff hasn't caught on is simple. For the past few years, it's been primarily not well-received, unscripted content that has no appeal outside of people already in the Cinemassacre ecosystem. I like to say that shift to scripted content this year will fix that, but as much as I've enjoyed the videos like the new VHS one he put out, I also have to acknowledge that it's not really a video that's going to appeal to anyone who doesn't already care about James and his love of video stores. And even his videos on Cobra Kai and Ghostbusters are only really interesting if you're already familiar with James and thus care about his opinion on these 2 franchise releases that have been out for a while. It would be really interesting to see James explore more stuff like this on the channel, like going more into essays and analysis and things like that. But right now, the content is too surface level, and furthermore, I don't get the impression that stuff like that is what James wants to do. Not to psychoanalyze a man I haven't met, but the thing I keep coming back to is that James Rolfe was never a YouTuber. James Rolfe is a filmmaker. I don't get the sense that he wants to do video essays, or that he wants to do Let's Plays, or that he wants to do podcasts or streams. James is the guy who turned talking shit about a video game into long boss battles against pop culture characters, because that's what he's interested in. He's the type of guy who turned a Let's Play a Board Game Together series into a long-form psychological horror piece. And if he does do anything outside of his usual filmmaking wheelhouse, it tends to be relaxed and chill, and stuff that relies on him explaining how he feels and his most pure, basic emotions regarding a property rather than any analysis, because James did not get into this to be a journalist or a critic or an essayist or a theorist. James got into this to be a filmmaker. I think that's why it's so easy to focus on the AVGN movie as a turning point for the channel. James got one shot to make his childhood dreams come true, and he used it on a film that wouldn't interest anyone not already in his fanbase, and then, surely enough, the only people interested in it was his fanbase. And it's interesting to imagine the alternate reality where James spent that time instead investing on other plans, other options, making an original movie, focusing more on non-nerd content, doing more creative series and projects like Board James. I have to wonder now if it's too late. Is anything James makes now that's not the nerd destined to come off as his demo reel? And I also wonder if any of this really matters, because right now it seems like James's primary priority is his kids and his family and doing what he needs to do for them. And like I said earlier, good for him. Like, I'm talking about all these analytics and breaking down his content release and speculating on options, but I don't know if James really cares about those options, nor am I sure I do either. I know I made fun of people defending stuff like Rex Viper by saying, well, at least James is having fun, but honestly, if this is what James is doing to be happy and he's making content the way he wants to make it, then good for him, I guess. I'm not going to say he's wrong for changing up his work or not changing up his work, nor am I going to act like he owes us content. If this is what makes him happy, fine. I'll still criticize it because it's still content being put out there for profit, but it's fine for him to do, and I don't really care all that much about him doing it. And if he wants to retire or scale back or keep doing what he's doing, then okay. I like James Rolfe. I like Cinemassacre. I like the Angry Video Game Nerd. I care a lot about this channel and its history and its future. I wouldn't have invested months of my life writing a 2-hour YouTube video if I didn't. And I picked this topic and stewed on it for this long because it allowed me to go through basically the entirety of YouTube and compare its beginnings to now. Just how the website has changed and how the way content is made and distributed on it has changed. When AVGN started, YouTube videos had to be 4x3 and shorter than 10 minutes, and now here it is, in an era when anyone can upload a dumbass 2-hour essay that's in 1080p, even though it probably doesn't need to be. It's the way you can track the various different ways in which YouTube as a business venture has changed, and the way one man's content over time has changed. 2021 wasn't a kind year to Cinemassacre, not by a long shot. But doing this vid helped me remember what made the series and this channel so great to begin with, and got me asking a lot of questions over what Cinemassacre, and YouTube as a whole really, is going to look like from now on. And I guess all I can do now is move on and hope for the best. This video talked a lot about online content and content creators and the difficulties that come from having to adapt to the challenges of YouTube. Thankfully, there's a service out there that helps creators like me by giving me the platform and support to make the content I want to make while also giving my fans the ability to watch these videos early and ad-free. I'm talking about Nebula, a streaming award-nominated service built by content creators for content creators. Get to experience exclusive and ad-free content from some of your favorite online essayists like Todd in the Shadows, Super Bunny Hop, Sarah Zed, who I've talked about a lot in this video, sorry, and me. It's the best way to watch content from creators you know, as well as discover exciting and cool new ones. And thanks to a deal with CuriosityStream, if you go to curiositystream.com/LadyEmily, you can get an entire year of CuriosityStream and Nebula for just $14.79, a 26% discount. If you don't know, CuriosityStream is a streaming service focused on documentaries and nonfiction content. This video focused a lot on the process of artistic creation in an algorithmic-fueled world, and if you found all that as interesting as I do, you should check out Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical, a documentary in which a team of scientists and writers try to create the proper formula in order for a computer to generate a good quality musical. Legit fascinating stuff in my opinion, especially as a person who loves musicals and also cares a lot about the art of writing. You can watch Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical as well as thousands of other excellent documentaries on CuriosityStream. And the best part is that so long as you have CuriosityStream, you'll also have access to Nebula. Once you use the code to sign up for CuriosityStream, you'll receive an email from Nebula granting you access. So go to curiositystream.com/LadyEmily to get a year of CuriosityStream and Nebula at a discount and enjoy the hours upon hours of content there is to choose from. Once again, I'd like to give a special shout out to my patrons who have been very helpful and very patient as I get this behemoth of a video out. And also, this has been a year of doing this, a year of doing video essays. This was it's probably not going to be out on the actual 1-year anniversary. But it's been a year now. So thank you all for being here for a year. And thank you to all of my patrons. I'd like to give a special shout out to Adam Ellison, Ale, Al is in the middle, Anselm, Arif Hassan, Alfred Sylvana Shipper, Azure Squirrel, Ben Holland, Brendan Buck, Brett Kozak, Bruni, Bulk, Caleb Guthrie, Cappuccino, Carmen J, Chad Horton, Cheyenne Jones, Christopher Patton, Cinemageddon Reviews, Clara M, Daisy Hind, Dan Connell, Dan Pierce, Dana Carrier, David Portnov, David Rose, Doc Trancy, Donovan Campbell, Ela Maxima, Eli, NB Extravaganza, Elijah Siddiqui, Elizabeth V. Haste, Elliot Berry, Emma K, Executive Nerd, Faye Gregory, Federic Ostrem, Game Champ 3000, Gavin Daphne King, John Carlo, Gwen Wafer, Halusi Gino, Huntakar, I'm doing a great job. That's the patron's name. That's not me complimenting myself. I would never. Ivory, James Dugan, James Rule, Jan the Final Girl, J. Marquez Durst, Jess, Jessica Lane, Jordan Tullis, Josh Sanders, Katrina Leonidakis, Kay Burris, Kelsey Hoover, Cooch Hustinator, Corono, Kyle Edman, Kyle Slaby, Madry Bread, Mason Barber, Matt Baker, Maxine, MD the Dude, Megatron Tarantulas, Michael Freytag, Mike Williams, Mr. Bones, Mr. Schmiff, Myriad, Nazreen, Nathan Y, Nick Skahe, Notka, Not Horses, Orbital Hippie, Quithar, Ramona Montagani, Richard Pryor, Robert Jones, Rose Dale, Sabrina, Saffron C, Sam Wade, Samantha Cinder, Samuel Snap, Sarah Lozano, Sarah Zed, who I talked about a lot, and should probably have not talked about as much. Sorry for exposing our operation. Scarebank, Sean Lane, Simon Welsh, Skylar Conlon, Sophie Uppercase, Sound Effects Madison, Sovereign Conscriss, Spencer Neil Campbell, Spoop Nudie, Stephen Fan, Dow, The Independent Shadow, Sanity Must Outrun Power, The Lair of Lore, The Recognition Scene, Third to the Left, Tim Delegati, Tobias Lutrine, Tommy Latilla, Trajan Dunkley, Unicorn Harrison, Ursula Major, Void Spooler, Woody Sims, Yov Fine, York, Yuna Ueda, and Zachary Brill. Thank you once again for all the support and contributions. Sorry if I messed up your name. If I did, let me know, as usual. And just thank you all. This has been an amazing year. I hope you enjoyed this massive video and that you've enjoyed the content. I'm really excited for... Oh no. It's the Rex Viper. He's coming to kill me because I talked badly about his band, and his venom made me change what my face looks like. Oh no. Thankfully I have my trusty Dragon Slayer here to take it down.